Right, guys, welcome. So we have FlightOfEros here. Regan and Zeal has also joined us, and we're going to be doing a very interesting discussion on the cycles of perturbation, and I guess you would call it social invagination, and we'll get into the definitions of that, and how that spurs on in the development of predatory behaviour, both within, I guess, species and within the society in general, human society. And then we'll be tying that in probably with this sort of digital technological matrix that we see in its nascent stages as of right now. So just to introduce everyone, we have FlightOfEros here, Regan and Zeal. If you guys want to introduce yourself.
Good evening, all. I am Zealberg, aka Zealberg.
Yep, and I'm FlightOfEros, just a dad, regular guy for the most part. Just love to do a lot of studying, autodidactic and everything. So just looking to make some observations and get some criticism and further insight into a lot of these matters.
And I am Regan. I host the channel Simplified Symbolism and do mostly more or less the same as what you just said, Flight. Just like I'm a pretty regular guy hailing from Detroit, Michigan.
Splendid. So without further ado, I think the first thing we should get into is, firstly, how do we define the cycles of perturbation? How does that produce what you mentioned, FlightOfEros, as chrononosis and chronoreceptivity? And what are the what's the importance of that within the development of societies and, I guess, the model of civilization that we see? And yeah, so we'll start there. And of course, invagination. If you want to cover those concepts for us, please.
Yeah, sure. Pretty big concepts, but I think it's important to try to get down to sort of the basics of phenomenological experience, some of the empirical things that we can observe, and then sort of move up from there to try to look for like basically necessary inference, right? On, well, if this obtains, if this is the situation we're dealing with here, then we can expect B and C and D and whatever else can follow, instead of just sort of just purely speculating in fields of just like pure abstraction about what may be happening or why it's happening. So trying to just anchor a few things in this process. But when we're looking at perturbation is essentially just, in very layman's terms, poking something, right? You're causing some amount of basically discomfort, pain. It just to not be too specific about it, on any kind of organism, and that's going to cause a reaction in that organism. So to cut right to the chase, you could talk about like essentially the sun as the main perturbator of the entire planet that we find ourselves on. This is obviously coming out of Bataille and the like, but perturbation from the sun is, everyone likes to talk about, well, the sun gives life. But if we really ask, what is life? Life is essentially this response to the influx from the sun, because what the sun is doing is it's a barrage on the earth of this electromagnetic radiation, right? Heat, all these things, which actually is a perturbation on the basic, most basic single cell organisms, and this causes a response in them. If they were to, let's say in some small body of water, some pond somewhere, and you had some scum on the surface, sure, through photosynthesis, it's going to eat up that perturbative energy coming in and convert that into an energy it can use. But everything else is essentially in response to this influx of energy reacting. So if you, for example, take like a single cell organism, and they've done experiments with this, obviously, and you apply a small electric shock to the single cell organism, it's going to respond to that perturbation of the electricity. And what it'll do is that it's going to begin, essentially, in what's called invagination, where it sort of turns in on itself. Now, this is part of the process of like embryology, right, in terms of development of a fetus, or along those lines, where you have the individual cells, and they might collapse in unto themselves to invaginate, and they'll pinch off into like, and then start splitting into different cells. But in terms of invagination and talking about perturbative aspects, what this essentially causes is an exterior impulse, right? So this is sort of like the other, right? And what this does is this establishes essentially the dichotomy, the duality of a self and other. Because once you have an organism, no matter how simple it is in terms of its nervous system's response, once you have an environmental stimulation, that process of invagination essentially creates a self on just a very biological level. It creates an individual unit, and then the environment from which, through some vector of space, right, this influx of energy, this perturbation upon it is coming. And essentially what happens is, through a long process, skipping all the science and stuff to cut to the chase, you essentially get the formation of nervous architecture, right? Like a nervous system, which eventually, outside of just a neural net, will centralize and become a central nervous system. And you could see that first among like planarian worms and what have you, and these biological life in which the central nervous system develops, and this is for the purpose of basically being able to predict further oncoming perturbation or pain, if you will, some kind of harassment to the organism itself. And then when this happens, it's the whole purpose of the nervous system is to gain what's called like feed-forward control, where you can then try to predict oncoming states of perturbation and in some way avoid or convert that energy that's coming in to try to maintain homeostasis, basically, of the organism, right? To try to maintain itself so that the perturbative aspects of the influx of the energy doesn't essentially overload the system and cause just an extreme amount of entropy and collapse of the organism, right? So, put a jellyfish out on a rock in a 100-degree day, it's going to quickly, that excessive perturbation is going to quickly break it down, and it's going to die, it's going to expire, it's going to basically get burned up because too much energy. So humans are obviously no different in this aspect. We are just these grand nervous systems with our spinal columns and our cerebellum on the cerebral cortex on the top, and the full flourishing of the nervous system. And so I find it important to, at least at the beginning stages of trying to figure out, what's happening on this planet. Why are we rushing in this direction? Why are we experiencing all this collapse and everything else? What is essentially the purpose of all of this that's happening? Is any of this avoidable? And then in addition to that, what this whole aspect of perturbation and invagination and collapse into ourselves, this is essentially setting the stage for all of our psychological goings-ons, all the negatives and positives of our psychological experience, but then as well what's actually happening on the earth. And I think if we really get these basics down, we can then begin to see what are our options going forward. Some people say, well, we need to resist what's happening, we need to go along with what's happening. Some people just don't care. And I believe the answer for all that is really found in this very basic duality of self and other, and this sort of primary perturbative environment that we find ourselves in, that there really isn't any escape from. Because if you take away that perturbative environment, there's no stimulus for an organism to essentially develop itself. It's developed into a self, right? Because there's no stimulus. It's just darkness, pure entropy, no movement, like a rock floating out in the blackness of space. There's no possibility for life. So what we consider life in actuality is really simply a response to pain. And the more you respond effectively to those incoming perturbations of pain, the more life you have. And the less you respond to that and retreat into basically the state of what some would say dead matter, right? Into a state that's less responsive to perturbation, the less life you have. And so, yeah, that's essentially the basic idea of that dynamic there.
So effectively, this is showing that, I guess you would call it the solar economy, and so the solar economy is based upon this concept of sacrifice. How would you, before we get in fact, before we get into that, something from our last discussion sort of popped into my mind while I was writing these questions out in these notes. And that's George Bataille. He actually founded a secret society known as the Asafali, I believe they're called. Effectively, it means the headless man. So the idea is that he believed that to truly connect with the cosmos, that I guess you would call it in modern parlance, the source code, that man had to lose his head, his reason or control. He had to become a being of pure drive, of pure will, I guess, in that sense. How do you, firstly, do you have any opinions upon that? And secondly, what do you think Bataille's thinking was behind that? And does that have any correlation with what we're seeing in the development of AI, and I guess you would call it the tech overlord class?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think in order to really understand Bataille, we do have to understand what came before, coming out of Kant and Hegel and Marx and all that sort of leading up to this, to what Bataille was saying. But because it is a bit farther down the line, because a lot of what he's talking about with what the sun is that, yeah, the whole perturbative aspect is there, like I just mentioned. But what it does is it actually produces essentially an excess, right? And these are sort of like this is sort of the excess of economy, where basically in very simple to understand terms, is that we end up producing the excess of production. Now, why do we have all this excess of production, right? And for this, you really have to get into Marx. And again, this jumps pretty far ahead, but when we look into commoditization, right? So with Marx, you have MCM prime, right, which is his basically the formula of how this exchange works, where you have M is for monetization, basically money, and C is for commodity, right? And when you take the two, what you want to do is you want to turn a profit on it. So you have the commodity that you're basically selling, you sell it for money, and you want to turn a profit that, and you get money prime, right? So you get something back in return more than what you put into the system, which is essentially, it's cybernetic, right? This is positive cybernetics. This is a feed forward situation. And this essentially happens because the sun does not maintain on the planet, and this is obviously coming from Bataille, the sun doesn't maintain with the planet some kind of homeostatic situation where we have just enough energy influx to have like a certain level of production. And by production here, we can go into the tribal situation, and we could be talking about like, catching rabbits or producing wicker baskets or something along those lines. But there's enough energy input into the planet and from the planet where there's an excess. There's more than enough deer. There's more than enough wheat. There's more than enough, right, fill in the blank, salmon. And so what you're able to do, and we talked about this last time, right, where we have, because of the tilt of the earth, the presence of the moon, right, we have this seasonal aspect for most of the planet where we go through perturbative cycle, right, of spring, summer, fall, winter. About, a good, depending on where you are on the planet, a good 5 months out of the year, you don't have a lot of access to the products of these energy of the energy, right? Deer, salmon, whatever, because of the winter seasons. And so because of this creates this asymmetry where when there is an abundance, humans, because of our nervous system allowing for feed forward control, allowing for predictability into the future, where we can observe the stars, we can observe the seasons and say, hey, it's going to get real cold. We're not going to have a lot of food. So don't just kill the rabbits that we need for today. Let's kill and store, right? Now, in order to do that, obviously you need techne, you need the production of technology, bows and arrows, and understanding the relationship between different objects and modes of energy on the planet. Like if I can get some salt and put it on this salmon, it'll preserve it, right? And so that all requires this very advanced nervous system. And so because if we have that ability and we can see into the future, so this is the chronognosis, right? This is the awareness of time, which allows us to both preemptively predict what's coming or try to predict what's coming. We're aware of the present, but we're also can extract from the past back up to the present and learn. We call that learning, right? From other perturbative experiences that we have had, what has and has not worked. We can observe the world around us. Through that whole process, we humans have this a highly advanced form of techne. We can take the environment, we can modify it, and we modify that environment and take that technology, again, even if it's just a bow and an arrow, and through that process, we can then obtain a surplus, right, through our technology. Now, that surplus originally might be, hey, we don't know where our next meal is going to be, so let's, kill the extra deer. Then it's, well, hey, there's this thing called winter, so let's kill even more. And then we need to store up this food, and then you get granaries, and here we go, we're off, we're in civilization now. And that starts this entire process. So because we produce the excess of this production, the way, and this is going to get straight into Nick Land and everything else, but what ends up happening is tribal cultures would often basically find a way to sort of like outgas or relieve that excess of production. And from Bataille's perspective, right, this is going to be done through forms of sacrifice or like potlatch, right, gift giving, to take that excess that you have and give it freely as a gift to someone else, or through the means of sacrifice, taking the extra calf that was born that wasn't exactly needed because we have enough, and then you sacrifice that to the gods to ensure better hunts into the future. And all these things. So this is sort of a means of, and this of course gets into human sacrifice as well, but that's kind of going down a different rabbit hole. But this means of getting rid of the excess, of burning up that excess.
Absolutely, yeah. Please finish your point.
Yeah, no, I'm saying is that the difference now is that what's happening is that there's so much excess, but a lot of the forms of sacrifice aren't really there anymore, and we've sort of went past this point. We've tripped past this point, and this is debated on where this point was, but I don't think anybody really disagrees that a major influx of this point was the introduction of the numeral 0, right, into the West, and as well the Reformation, right, in Christianity, the invention of the printing press, and all these other things that really just gave this massive boost to the ability to produce things. Because, I mean, if you just look at a purely productive level, maybe not everybody knows how to, quickly produce this X, Y, or Z. But just with the printing press, you can get that information out to everybody. Now, all the farmers know how to do that without it having to travel by word of mouth. So through our excessive production of technology, this creates this sort of feed forward, this feedback loop, this positive feedback loop, where, again, just as Mark said, we're able to, what we put into the system, we end up getting more out of it. And we put in and then we get more. And every leap in evolution and technology ends up allowing for greater production and greater production and greater production. So it becomes this sort of snowball effect, this runaway situation where we have this massive production of excess. Now we call that capitalism, right? And this is what Marx was pointing out, right, and stuff in his critiques of these things, is that what's happening here is that this is basically a runaway machine, like Marx called it. It's vampiric. Is that it essentially takes up that perturbative aspect that humanity finds ourselves in, just with being on a planet, being a biological organism, and having a star. Those are just the very basics that you really need for this capitalistic process to take place. And my position, this is also the position of Nick Land, right, and these other thinkers, is that this is essentially an inevitable process. This capitalism essentially it's not socioeconomic. It's not a social phenomenon. This is a phenomenon of, it's a biological, energetic phenomenon. Its root is found in the very basic structures of biology, and not in a social arrangement. Therefore, any solution to this problem can't come from something like a communism or socialism or something along these lines, because the phenomenon itself is not rooted in a social structure. It's rooted in a cosmological structure. It's rooted in the very interaction between entropy and negentropy. And intelligence, right, is that thing that brings in the negentropic aspect to the otherwise hyper-perturbative state of the universe, which is going to push towards this pure entropic state. Intelligence brings this in, but the way that intelligence brings this in is through this feed forward mechanism of excessive production, right? So the big problem is, the big question is, okay, so if we're in this situation, and this can be argued and we can get into more detail about all this stuff, but if we actually are in this situation, what do we do about this? Because to retreat is to go back towards basically the dissolution of a CNS, the dissolution of a self. And you see this in Buddhism, or at least some forms of Buddhism, right, and stuff, where you have a dissolution to the self. But it would seem that any reification of the self, which is what allows for an external world in the first place, then requires this positive feedback loop of production of materials, of goods, of what have you, to sustain your life against the perturbative aspects of the environment that we find ourselves in. And, it's very hard. Scientists speculate, but they're very doubtful of life on different planets without the presence of, some very basic things on the planet and a star, in some proximity to the planet to provide what they call life, but which I understand to be just pure perturbation.
Absolutely. I mean, as well with I was going to mention in terms of this sort of the boom and bust cycle that you see macrocosmically, for example, with the solar economy, as we were mentioning. Of course, you see the sort of microcosmic reflection of that through, of course, our own boom and bust cycles. I mean, arguably as well, we still have sacrifice. We just have better ways of concealing it. So, for example, the various financial crashes, those are all planned. They're planned to effectively get rid of the excess, which is the source of wealth, at least in some certain strata of society, to diminish that. Then, of course, once you've laid barren that field, you can reseed it and till it, reseed it and regrow it. So it maintains this cycle of infinite growth, this perception of infinite growth, like what you were saying, this sort of positive feedback loop of everything. However,
and just real quick to hop in
yeah.
there, I should have clarified that in tribal societies, the bust was artificially put in that mode of sacrifice to do off with the excess, and then so therefore it kind of reverted to a more homeostatic state for the tribe. And so it was beneficial for holding off this sort of capitalistic runaway that would otherwise take place. You're correct that the sacrifice still happens today, but that sacrificial aspect is governed by the elite, right? And they use that sacrificial boom and bust for their own benefit. And the tribe, if you will, the proletariat, right? All of us, the working class man and woman, we don't actually benefit from that, because as soon as the bust happens, right again, here we are back into excessive modes of production and what have you over various forms of exchange value and all these other things.
Absolutely, yeah. Interestingly as well, sort of fast forward into, I guess, logically extrapolating this sort of capitalistic runaway positive feedback loop. eventually you get to the point where this elite, they fundamentally want to do away with, or at least simplify in a very, I guess you would say, obtuse and predatory manner, in a manner that ensures total predictability and stability in the system, similar to, of course, what the sun produces. They want to almost create a false sun out of themselves, where they produce an autopoietic system. I mean, could you speak to that as well? What is the need within the elite at a certain threshold within this sort of runaway of profit and excess? Well, controlled excess, and I guess we would call it progress, capitalistic progress. Why will it always reach this sort of stakeholder, technotronic? I mean, what would you call it? You know, I don't even think we have a name for it that does it justice. But this sort of AI-infused autopoietic system, this system of negentropy at the end of time.
No, I think the primary reason for that is that a lot of it boils down to efficiency of production. And humans tend to be really messy. We care about stuff like all of these values, like love and what's I want this to be a certain color, and all these little proclivities and stuff. We get tired. Sometimes we're motivated to produce, sometimes we're less motivated to produce. Sometimes you want to lay out by the river and just stare at the clouds, and that's not always productive. And so what ends up happening is, in this grand perturbative system, there's other entities that are part of this process, right? And so it immediately becomes a competitive environment in which we're in, or predatory environment. Essentially the same thing, I'm saying they're synonymous. And in that environment of predation and competition, if we're competing for these resources, and we're going through this whole process here, what has to essentially happen is you have to basically outgame everybody else. If you're going to maintain your survival. So the perturbative process, I call the grand perturbator, is the sun driving the entire system. But there is sort of a hierarchy of perturbation that's going to come down. You have a boss that tells you what to do, and if you don't do it, then you're fired. There's some extra perturbation for you, right? So what ends up happening is we're in this hierarchical system of different grades of perturbation, and you have to essentially fight to survive in this process. Now, the more efficiently that you can anticipate oncoming perturbation and avoid or transmute that perturbation into a gamified sort of advantage for yourself, the better you can survive that process, the more you can advance your particular right will to power, right? Nietzsche. And we now not so much in the will to power of, I think, of how it's like, kind of vulgarly understood in terms of, oh, well, I want to be the boss, so I'm just going to go be the boss. But I think Nietzsche, what he was really talking about was really this perturbative aspect is what he's talking about, is this will to life, this striving for your will to be expressed in the world, in the cosmos. Even if that's on a very basic level of like, hey, I don't want to starve. That's still your will, right? Because you have this invaginated, collapsed self. And that interior collapse allows for an exterior world, but then you find in that exterior world multiple hierarchies of perturbation upon your individual self. And then even at the most basic level, you're not trying to be a CEO, you're just trying to get to your next meal. That requires attempting to outgame the situation and the predatory environment you're in. So there is an efficient way to do that. There's a more efficient and a less efficient way for every interaction, perturbation that you encounter to navigate that process. And why this always sort of trickles up in terms of the elite is some people are just going to be better at it than others. And some people are going to just have a better predatory insight, advantage. Some people just call it luck, born into certain families, what have you, where they're able to be taught the right things at the right times, You're damn lucky if you're born into the tribe that invents the bow and arrow before everybody else, right? And you can capitalize on that advantage to increase your production, which is your survivability, right? To manifest your will to power in the world. And so it's going to always trickle up, and why it heads towards AI. I mean, that's a really big, like, very complex question, and we got to, if we really wanted to get detailed, we kind of want to run Kant, from Kant all the way up through the process, right? When we can see why is it heading in that direction. But I guess to try to simplify it as much as possible is what a CNS does. A central nervous system essentially creates a representation of the world for you, right? And it creates this sort of not necessarily, it's not necessarily a false world, but what it is that the qualia of sensation that comes in to your senses is essentially interpreted and processed by your brain, and it takes a certain smell, the color red, and a soft touch, and it'll take those different qualia, those different sensations, and combine them into flower as a perception, as a rose, right? And this whole combinatorial process happens essentially instantaneously. You're not really aware of individual sensations for the most part, but sort of the combined holistic interpretation of the world. But this is a representation of the environment. It's not the environment in itself. And a lot of this is from Kant, right? Kant is telling us that you have the noumena and the phenomena, and we only have access to the phenomena, and you can't access the thing in itself. And so because we don't have access to that, we only have access to representation. So immediately, from a CNS standpoint, we're sort of in this situation of representational abstraction by the very nature of a CNS. Again, it's not a social situation. It's not a religious situation. It's not something that we're sort of choosing to do. We are sort of just automatically given the preconditions, the axiomatic, biological, cosmological situation we're in. We're in a situation where we are already in the very sensation of the world in a sort of a process of abstraction from the world. Right. So you'll see this in like Baudrillard, right? As obviously is more advanced as this process is understood throughout the centuries, but Baudrillard is, talk in like simulacra and simulation, right? It's talking about how there is no real left, right? There is only simulacra, representations of representations of representations. But this goes all the way down to the very basic planarian worm. The planarian worm is dealing with simulacra and simulations, right, as a combinatorial process of these different simulacra that a nervous system is going to interpret for you. So this is the understanding that's sort of setting up the world for AI, because that's what essentially these computational systems do, right? Norbert Wiener, with his work in cybernetics and what have you, is that predicting, like, when they're working on these anti-aircraft systems, Norbert Wiener, right? And they're tracking flights of planes and jets through the sky. You can't obviously, right, shoot at the jet where it is in space the moment you press the trigger, because of the distance between you and the jet is moving, and the bullet has a certain velocity, right? You have to actually project where the plane will be and shoot ahead of the target to actually intercept the target. That very simple process, which is a dynamic of a entity or body moving through space and time, right? That very simple process requires this predictive ability to be able to see where something, project into the future, where something will be in the next few seconds. There's a more or less efficient way to do that. And once you get that essentially system worked out of being able to do that, you see, well, hey, when I predict accurately into the future, when winter starts, where the deer will be, right, when the salmon come back to this area, when I'm able to accurately predict that, I have less pain or death, right, perturbation. I don't have to watch my kids starve. So because that situation is there, just ipso facto, by the very nature of the fact of that situation, this will eventually lead towards the production of computational systems, which can do the computation quicker and faster, more accurately than your brain can. And then that leads right into sort of these massive representational systems of AI. And the elite are so tied to this whole process because they are determined to be the tip of the spear in that process of predation.
You also find as well, absolutely, I totally agree with what you're saying, but with the rise of AI and these these various systems that have now, well, they're almost becoming the bulwark, the crux of society itself, and what ironically provides society meaning, which is the way in which data is processed, the rapidity in which it's processed. We seem to be a world, a society, a civilization that prides ourselves on that speed of informational processing. Yet, at the same time, we also seek to undermine and diminish, not ourselves, but of course the elite. They seek to undermine and diminish the ability for the human being to almost relay meaning to that process, that informational processing. So what I mean is they have less weighted value to the ascribing of meaning to the information than they do to its processing. Do you think that's going to have knock-on effects to the culture as well, and even to the survivability of this new and intrepid civilization we're in?
So just to get a little bit better understanding, are you talking about how this entire process of this sort of capitalistic hyper efficiency model does away with meaning, or are you talking about the elites because it's nihilistic in and of itself? They're ascribing meaning for us to it. I'm just a little confused on what you're asking.
Probably more along the lines of the first one. So the idea is that the elite want to establish a population who are nihilistic. They want to establish a population that can't necessarily ascribe meaning to information. They only seek to, for example, epistemically outsource to AI their processing of that information and the capabilities thereof. And they want to, diminish their ability to think, thus to ascribe meaning. So yeah, more along the lines of the first question, I would say.
Gotcha. Yeah. Well, this is gonna it's gonna get a little repetitive, but it all goes back to Kant, because once Kant starts this process, there's a good bunch of YouTube guys. They don't do very many videos, but they have this one video that's very good. The title of it is the Konzenberg Executioner, and Kant was from Konzenberg in Germany, and Kant is this executioner essentially of meaning, because after him, there is this disconnect from what previously was what everybody thought was this easy access to this sort of infinite source of meaning, which they called God, right? And Nietzsche eventually gets to this and proclaims the death of God. Not that Nietzsche kills God, but Nietzsche is just declaring what has already happened and what's been boiling up for a while. Nietzsche is just the prophet to proclaim God is dead and we have killed him, right? And so, because you have this death of God, which is, yeah, it's talking about the Christian God, but what's a lot of what it's primarily referring to really is this death of sort of this external source of meaning for everybody, right? Why do you exist? I'm here because God made me and I'm here to serve him, right? And I'll be redeemed by Christ. And it gives you this whole sort of basket of meaning that you can pull from. But after essentially that collapse, the only meaning that you can try to generate is sort of this meaning from yourself, from your own essential experiential meaning. Of course, someone else can now offer you meaning that is not directly connected to the Abrahamic faith, right? And so this, in a sense, does give this ability now for, once meaning has been taken away, now new forms of meaning can be given to you. We see this with starting with the Reformation, right? Once the Reformation happens, that begins to fracture and break up a lot of this stabilized epistemic sort of monolithic tower of meaning, right? That the Roman Catholic Church gives you all your meaning by its interpretation of the scripture, and it's good enough for you. You take it, you live your short life, you die. And the Reformation, again, because of that principle of sola scriptura, where each individual person can now interpret, he can have the Bible in his own language because of the printing press, and these new ideas from Luther and Zwingli and all these other reformers are coming along and saying, well, no, you need to be able to understand this for yourself and not just listen to what somebody else says. So now each man opens up his Bible and finds his own meaning in the text. Right, and it's this process of, you can see this where you'll have this sort of like liberal deterritorialization, where it sort of opens up and we're looking for new meaning and new interpretations of the text, and then it'll lock down, and it will turn into a hierarchical system. The Church of England, Reformed Calvinists, Lutheran, and then it sections off into these territorialized organizations. Right, this is the meaning of the text, and then out of that organization, someone says, well, what about this verse? And we didn't look at the Greek here, so we actually missed this, and that splits off, and so you get this rhizomatic effect where meaning is no longer centralized, but it's just dispersed 1,000-fold everywhere. And what this does is, through the process of history, we then see that in all of that chaos, no one can find any like stabilized meaning anymore. And this essentially churns up the whole bucket, and people, turn to this sort of nihilistic state, which is what Nietzsche said would happen, right? And then through the guiding sort of hands of the elite, running, starting wars and boom and bust and all this stuff, everyone's sort of getting whiplashed back and forth through all of these highly perturbative environments. No one really has the time or energy to try to establish meaning for themselves, and then if they do, there's an entire web of possibly false meanings or meaningfulness that is only there to get other predators essentially ahead of you. So they're going to give you some form of meaning, right, on how you should respond to the Charlie Kirk assassination, and this is how you should respond, and this is the meaning in your life, and whatever have you. But this is just to further their agenda. And because we have no firm ground anymore, we can be easily taken through this whiplashing process left and right, and used essentially to further the process and construction of this hyper predator system.
Yes, it's a psychological warfare technique. It's effectively the hall of mirrors of postmodernity at the end of history, as Francis Fukuyama stated. Effectively, you become a tabula rasa because of it. You're locked into this confounding mess, and you're constricted by it. Yeah. Before I change gears, change tacks, with the questions, Zeal or Regan, do you want to ask any questions on what we've covered thus far?
I'm just going to pop in with a kind of more of a general question to FlightOfEros, just based on FlightOfEros, your own readings and your own ideas about things. We use this terminology, the elite or the power structure, or the globalist, as it were. If we could be sort of self-reflective for a minute here, how accurate are we in using those terms? How reasonable a deduction is that to come to? And just to expand a bit on the question, do you agree, for example, that we're living in a unipolar world and where there's sort of one power structure? And if so, how does that power structure exist in and around things like national governments? And are we looking at sort of Big Brother or a committee of men around a table somewhere? And we can kind of get into almost like comic book depictions, but like how reasonable do you think we are to come to that sort of conclusion? And what is the actual characteristics of that structure, do you think, in the real terms?
Yeah, that's a big question. I do think that there is a structure to it. I don't think that it is so multipolar. I believe it's sort of a sliding scale, but I don't believe it's so multipolar where there's just individual billionaires and governments, and they're all just vying for power constantly. I do believe that there is a certain level of agreement and talk and shaking of hands behind the scenes. I mean, if we just look at like the level of weapons and technology that are available now, I mean, as far as we know, they can develop all of these different um, viruses, weapons, what have you. That can you could just take out entire countries. You can take out whole groups of people, whole lineage of people. Haplogroups. You can just knock out all this stuff by all of their the level of technology of things, how things have gotten to, in terms of CRISPR and everything else, where they can just do all these modifications and what have you. So I one thing that I don't do is that if whatever powers, there are powers that be. I mean, there's no question about that. They're billionaires. They decide when we go to war, and we don't really have much say in the matter, and in these governments. So these powers that be, I think it's always better in sort of an art of the war sort of way, never to underestimate them. You don't want to overestimate too far, but if I'm just some guy who kills bugs for a living, like I said, and I can see a lot of this stuff, and we're all just working class people, and we can see a lot of this stuff. I don't think for one second that these guys who have sort of an extreme degree of power because of their wealth and assets can't see a lot of these things too, or at least get have advisors who see a lot of these things. And so I think they're very much aware of the situation we're in. I think they know it's a highly predatory environment. And I think that because of the state of production of technology, of the weaponry that's in place, that I think a lot of the wars and what's the fighting and what have you is going on now, I think a lot of that is sort of agreed upon to a certain degree behind closed doors. And that's just because I just can't see. I don't attribute to them that level of stupidity to, let's just say, like, start trying to invade or strike another country just because they want some more oil and they want to survive, when that country's ally could essentially hit a button, cyber attack them, take down the entire nation in the course of a night, essentially, and just plunge the entire area into complete chaos. So there has to be some level of organization and talk amongst them. So I think, stepping back out to a little bit of a larger picture, I think that they fully see where this whole process is going. I think they see that because of the situation of the planet, of the cosmos, where we find ourselves in, that this is going to get to a point of these extreme. It's like a chess game that's happening, where as you progress through technology, information, through this sort of linear time frame that we perceive, as you progress through this, that each move becomes more devastating and more critical as you go. So they're not stupid. I mean, they can clearly see every meme that comes out now can just drastically affect everything. So because I think they're aware of the hypersensitivity to novelty, that's happening because of the mass production of information that we have now. There's an extreme amount of novelty which can very quickly destabilize environments, right? And so that's where there's this race for AI, because AI can not only take in all of this information, excuse me, take in all this information, but then have this hyper accurate and powerful predictive power on how these destabilizing effects might happen, and then it can auto-correct that in sort of a negative feedback loop, not a positive feedback loop, negative feedback loop, to achieve homeostasis where they want homeostasis, and achieve deterritorialization, or allow that novelty to produce something new in a certain area, right? So ultimately it comes down to control, because again, going down to the very basics, if you can exert through intellect control within the environment, you can essentially move into that stage of a hyper predator.
So is it fair to say, like, that in that case, like, things like our national governments are like anachronisms? They've been bypassed. They're no longer the final power as such. Like, is it fair to say that?
Yeah, I would think so. I think a lot of the government is government goings-ons is, I think, pre-planned, and I'm not necessarily even saying pre-planned by human planning. I think that they're probably vastly far ahead in AI production than what we're made aware of. We're aware of these LLMs and a lot of these basic things. I think that they likely have far greater predictive because ultimately the greatest predator is the one that can predict most accurately into the future. That's the greatest predator. They know this. Norbert Wiener figured this out, right? This is cybernetics 101. They knew this in the 40s, right? So the greatest predator is the one that has the most predictive power.
Yeah.
And so, go ahead.
This is why they have the sentient world simulation,
Exactly.
and not yeah. So it's right there. It's basically
Sorry to
what.
cut across.
Yeah, jump in.
No, go ahead. Finish your point. Sorry.
Yeah, no, just really quick. It's like what you're saying. It's basically the predator that can understand its prey, and
Yeah.
in terms of all of its dimensionalities, all of its
Yes.
angular framing, and to
Yeah.
like what you were mentioning, Eros, with Norbert Wiener and his work upon radars and predictive radar systems, tracking that predator and where it will go, or of course as well producing sentient world simulations, AI systems in which you can nudge. You've seen that a lot, that terminology. During, of course, the event of 2020, and it's become a recent phenomenon where they're talking about nudge programming in terms of population management. So that, of course, that's how an AI would produce incremental, imperceptible changes within human populations through this nudging.
Yeah, and the key word there is imperceptible because the greatest predator is that predator that also is imperceptible, right? And the imperceptibility comes into play when you can have a high amount of accurate information processing, right? So when you're able to gather from all the cell phones, all the media, all the conversations, you can gather in all of this information. The more accurate the input of data, the more accurate you can predict into the future, right? And so when you're able to gather in all this information, you're aware in terms of like live time what's happening, the small micro adjustments that are occurring, and you can then make your own micro adjustments. And because the mass of humanity is not in this predatory state, they're not seeing the micro adjustments. I mean, again, just you could just look at nature. Watch a National Geographic episode where they like zoom in on a jaguar stalking a gazelle or something, right? I mean, it is so hyper focused. It's looking at every micro movement of the gazelle, of the wind through the brush, and it's adjusting its prowl based upon which direction the wind is which direction the wind is blowing, how the grass is moving, where the gazelle is looking, right? And it'll freeze, and then it'll creep, and it'll freeze, and then it makes its choice to actually do its sprint and its attack. And so the more information you can take in, right, the better you can predict and be successful in your hunt in that predation aspect. And so what they quickly figured out is that that's what a computational system is. It's essentially an extension of our nervous system, right? And so what is essentially happening now is that what's essentially it's our intellect is essentially we've been able to, through our extreme power of creativity and techne, we've been able to externalize our nervous system now, or the primary function of our nervous system, predictability, into an exteriorized entity, right? And then now that exteriorized entity is essentially doing the hunting for us, or it's doing the hunting for the people who have the $1 billion to fund it, right?
This is the Jardine noosphere. So the three stages of biological development upon the Earth, eventually leading to the noosphere, which is the mind or the thought taking precedent in terms of the environmental coat of paint, so to say.
Yep, and remember what the CNS does, it's predicting into the future, but in order to predict in the future, what is it doing by definition? It's abstracting from past and present influxes of information. So it's a process of abstraction, right, of information, and which is essentially, as you know, as we experience it, conceptualization. I am conceptualizing the location of the airplane 3 seconds from now, and I'm going to fire at that
Yeah.
imaginal point where there is no airplane, but because I'm able to conceptualize, velocity and all these other do the calculation, I know that the plane will be there. But it's in the moment before the bullet hits the plane and it arrives 3 seconds later. During that travel time, from my perspective, it is a pure abstraction. It's just a pure conceptualization, right? So now this is a critical point and this is where powers that be, and you could say it's an AI telling them what to do. I mean, that's more along the lines of where I lean. But this is where the elite have this is one of their primary basically hunting methods, if you want to use that terminology, is where that same ability that allows for that predictive successful hunt, right, that predictive impact on the plane with the bullet, that same ability is allows for that Promethean prediction into the future for success. That same ability allows for deception, because through the process of abstraction and conceptualization, well, that's what psychological warfare is all based off of, right? Is taking past information, present information, right? So, left versus right, radical leftists, right-wing Nazis. Charlie Kirk was just assassinated, right? That's the current event happening right now live. But now we all will immediately begin to abstract. It was a radical leftist. It was a radical rightist. They can now take that situation and plug into that situation an abstract conceptualization on why this event happened. And then we become deceived. And you think that the airplane is going to be in this position in space in 3 seconds, but it's actually not, and you miss. Because they told you that, oh, this is what's actually happening, and therefore this will follow, and we believe it because once you step into that awareness of self and other, you are abstracting from that environmental information, which creates a representation of the world. And the goal is to have that representation of the physical world be as accurate as possible, but it's sort of like it's the ability to be accurate and predict in the future also gives you the ability to be wrong in your prediction in the future, and hence we're liable to be deceived, right? And so this is the knowledge. There's a tree of the knowledge of good and evil, right? Where that awareness of self and other, that awareness of duality, the knowledge itself is what allows for progression in terms of surviving a perturbative environment, but it also allows for the destruction of the individual through deception.
Yes. Yeah.
And that's predator-prey relationship, where prey is always trying to deceive predators through camouflage, right? Through scent masking or whatever it is, right? Decoys, right? You have prey animals are always trying to evolve ways to deceive predators. Because the predator is using predictive sort of almost algorithmic thinking to catch its prey, because that is a possibility for it to predict where the antelope will be, the antelope tries to deceive. So then you have this game of cat and mouse of prediction and deception.
Yeah, and please jump
Does
in.
it follow
Jump in,
then, does it follow sort of logically, rationally then from that, from that mechanism that the power structure, the biodigital thing is the next step in data? Because you can have as much data as you want, but if it's not data that's relevant to where you want to go, it's kind of extraneous data. So it seems to me that it follows now logically that the biodigital sort of convergence is the next step in for the apex predator, as it were, to hone its scent for predictability, to become the apex predator, and have that capacity prediction, so that its prey, as it were, the human being, the social animal, and the data that would come from a sort of a biodigital connectivity would be invaluable to them to achieve and maintain their kind of that status. And would you agree with that? Like, and if just to extrapolate out your point on it perhaps a little bit, how prevalent have you found this narrative around this biodigital stuff to be? Is it the only show in town at the moment? Is it the elephant in the room? Like, how big is it based on your readings or on your own understanding of it?
Yeah, I think it's multi-tiered in terms of like objectives. It's not that there's just one objective, but once one objective is obtained, that will necessitate and apply the necessary and sufficient conditions for a higher objective. Now, that higher objective, I'm not entirely sure yet that the elite even are aware of what that is. But what they enjoy is that perceived hyper predator, but there might be a hyper predator above them that is essentially so good at what it does that it is camouflaged from the predators who think that they're the top dogs. And it is predating them as well as everybody else in this hierarchical structure. But in terms of the biodigital thing, absolutely. I mean, if given the opportunity and the sentience, right, or the awareness to think of these concepts, would an alpha wolf prefer to implant something into the deer's head to force that flock of deer to run straight into the jaws of the rest of the pack and itself? Well, absolutely. That's more efficient than going out in the dead of winter, having to stop for miles and miles and miles to try to just find the scent of one deer. Just, implant a chip into them, and then we can just maneuver them where we see fit. Now, why I say that... Go ahead.
Well, sorry to cut across you, but just to expand on your metaphor there, does the wolf accidentally, bring about his own downfall, as it were? Because when he, just to expand on the metaphor, when he puts the chip in the deer's head, it makes things a lot easier for him. But by virtue of doing that, like, he sort of negates his own primal natural instinct and his capacity to hunt, and his nose to the wind, as it were, becomes dull, and he becomes, a bit more lackadaisical in his approach, and eventually, ironically, he sort of undermines his own capacity to maintain his natural status at the apex, as it were. So, and just to, is this something that perhaps the power structure may inevitably find themselves in this situation where they, they're looking for an easy run at this, when they cultivate this scenario, this mechanism, that they eventually somehow, sow the seeds of their own downfall, because they lose their fangs, their nose, their capacity to hunt, as it were.
That's literally what I was about to say in my next sentence. Yeah, yeah, exactly. Is that what ends up happening is there is this very curious self-negation that happens in this predatory process, where once you reach this level of techne, once you reach this level of technology, where you're able to get to this standpoint, what ends up happening is a degradation of that predatory prowess and ability. Arnold Schwarzenegger, he was competing when he was competing with I forgot his name and stuff, but they asked him, so how's it feel to be, the top dog? How's it feel to be on the top of the mountain? And Arnold said, it makes me very uncomfortable. He says, I want to be the hungry wolf who's only halfway up the mountain, right? Because I worry about, getting too lazy. Because at that time he was competing with a lot of guys who were really, really strong, right? Really had really good physiques, and he had the best, but he's like, I don't want to get lazy with it, kind of thing. So there is definitely that ability, because when we actually start to extrapolate on this process of The avoidance or transmutation of perturbation, what we're doing is we are avoiding pain, right, and maximizing essentially pleasure. Okay. Now there's a really important novel. I don't know if you guys have read it. It's a little novella written in 1994, so it's a bit old. It's called The Metamorphoses of Prime Intellect. I don't know if you've heard of that one.
No, I haven't. No.
Okay, reader beware. It's descriptions of hyperviolence. How to put this in a PG? Crossing what everybody would essentially consider to be modes of violence and what for lack of a better term, immorality. So reader beware if you're squeamish about stuff that is beyond the limits of what anybody would really consider okay. But essentially, this book is it's a novel about humanity achieves essentially an AI hyperintelligence, and the AI hyperintelligence basically understands that the entire purpose for existence is to maximize basically pleasure and do away with all pain, right? So it's the avoidance of all possible perturbation, and it's able to achieve this by harnessing, right, all the materials of the planet. So for humans, it's able to set up essentially heaven, right? And it sets up this, yeah, that's the one, Metaphors of Prime Intellect, and it essentially sets up this situation through modifying the physics of the environment, through understanding the full breadth and depth of quantum mechanics and everything else. It can it can set up for each individual person their sort of own heaven space. What ends up happening, though, is everybody gets bored because it's just like constant orgasms, constant, right, unlimited amounts of food, constant pleasure and no pain. They end up, constructing these simulations of pure pain for themselves or for other people, of nothing but, torment and the worst degradations and all these other things. Anyways, it's a very intense novel, quite short, but what it's essentially illustrating is this predator-prey dynamic. If it ends up in a situation where we are essentially hooked up to feeding tubes and unlimited supply of Pornhub and everything else, where you can just essentially plug in, it actually turns into sort of this completely aberrant exit from life, where you end up in a situation of just pure pleasure, and what you will actually seek after that as this sentient human is in a very Lacanian sense, this jouissance, this want for destruction, this want for pain, because really you cannot have it on the other side, or too far on one side, right? So that's a good novel to illustrate that point. But yes, absolutely. When the problem is that in the gathering of all of this information and establishing this situation where, as biological organisms, we're trying to avoid perturbation, if we actually are able to become successful in that, it's very dangerous, reaching a point of essentially regressing back into a blob, right? Back to that jellyfish that we kind of talked about last time, right? Where, this is nirvana, right? This is the goal of the standard schools of Buddhism. The standard schools of Buddhism is to essentially eliminate the self, and in eliminating of the self, you eliminate the other. And in this process of eliminating self and other, you destroy any possibility for perturbation, because that's what they're trying to escape, right? Dukkha, suffering, or perturbation. So the whole point is to exit the cosmos, essentially, and that will allow because the Buddhist analysis is correct. Life is suffering. Life is constant perturbation. That is the definition of life, is the response to perturbation. And you respond to perturbation through the self. Otherwise, you have no self, and there's nothing to respond to. So the Buddhism is trying to exit that. And the same thing is with Neoplatonism, the same thing with Gnosticism, right? Is these exits, or attempted exits, from the perturbative environment in which we are in. And I think Buddhism is most accurate in it, the Abrahamic faiths, or even Gnosticism with the Pleroma and stuff. But, the Abrahamic faiths will talk about a heaven, which is just like, bliss, and there's no more pain, right? Revelation says, Christ will wipe all the tears from their eyes. And interestingly enough, in the book of Revelation, it says that I'd have to pull it up here, but just to paraphrase it, it says he shall in the new heavens and new earth, Christ will wipe away all tears from their eyes. And then it says, and it's talking about those who are redeemed in heaven, the elect. It says, now watch this. It says, the sun shall not light upon them, neither any of its heat. Rather, the Son of God shall be the light amongst them, right? Or Christ will be the light amongst them. So, I mean, I can't imagine Bataille did not read this verse and see right into this. The book of Revelation is literally saying that the sun will be no more, and the light and the heat, right? That's that that radiative, perturbative aspect from the sun. The light and the heat from the sun will not be on them anymore. It's talking about exiting perturbation, right? There's no grand perturbator anymore. And really, I mean, if we're taking the metamorphosis of prime intellect, we take that sort of thesis as a danger. Heaven is sort of the ultimate hell, right? In that sense. And Buddhism takes it a little bit farther, though, where they say, no, we're not even looking for heaven. We are just going to destroy the self, and there won't be experience of, essentially neither heaven nor hell, and which is essentially just pure annihilationism, right? So, in a very real sense, the elite are striving in a very Abrahamic way, are striving for this promise of a non-perturbative environment, and they think they can do that by becoming essentially this sort of top predator.
Well, this is also sort of wrapped up, of course, in the self-fulfilling prophecies of the Abrahamic eschatologies, as you mentioned, even in the mystical Abrahamic eschatologies, such as Kabbalah with the Tikkun Olam, for example. And in the Zohar, it speaks about something similar. This, perfect paradise after we effectively, immerse or baptize the entire world in a mass conflagration. So, linking this back, of course, to the sort of modern Betalist stone, and we can go into that if you want, Tezcatlipoca too, and perhaps the sort of, like what you were mentioning with Revelation, it appears as though the ancients had a deep, perhaps intuitive understanding of these cycles of perturbation, but you almost see that the artificial invagination that occurs within societies, of course, with the sort of models of scarcity and the economic model of artificial wars, permacrisis, all of this notion. What they're attempting to do is get rid of perturbation, at least as it affects them. But it's almost like it's a position of fear. It's not necessarily a position of confidence or supreme control, even though it appears to be masquerading as such through, of course, the predictability afforded by these machines of artificial intelligence. So effectively, what they're attempting to do is in an evolutionary manner, is maneuver to hide themselves away from, the sine wave of external perturbation. It's almost an irony in that sense, but on a grander scale, could we not say that perhaps this is a natural process? This is a grander boom and bust cycle that the universe, almost in a subtle or unconscious manner, is driving us towards destroying ourselves, bringing ourselves to this sort of deleterious doom, to thus wipe away ourselves and begin yet again.
Yeah. I mean, absolutely. I think you're like essentially right over the target. Why it's built for, why it's sort of based in fear, is because, again, it comes down to that our perceptive apparatus, the matrix, the structure of which in which our mind is structured, in which we perceive the world, is that because we're able to look into the future and abstract from past experiences and current present circumstances. We can abstract out of that and project into the future a situation, a series of events. We can then fear the events where perturbation's high or what we think is too high for us, and seek events of low perturbation. So I better pull the turkey out of the oven before it burns. Even just the simple things like that. I'm feeling kind of sick. I got a huge headache. I got to show up for work tomorrow. Otherwise, right? Excessive perturbation. I'll be fired, and then I have fear because of that pain that's going to come when I run out of money and I can't eat. My kids don't have any food, right? Because what we are afraid of is the suffering, is the fear, right? And so that fear of that possible suffering in the future hasn't happened yet, but because of our past experiences, we say, well, every time that this has happened, or I have heard every time this happens, X happens, then Y follows, and Y is a lot of suffering. So we want to avoid that. So then you have fear about not being able to avoid that process, and that fear drives a lot of behavior. Now, this isn't just a human thing. It's much more pronounced in the human because of our ability to project into the future, right? Magnus Carlsen, if he's playing a game of chess, he can see as soon as a move is made, 8 steps into the future, oh, I lost already, because he can predict that far ahead in the game that he's playing, right? And so there's a lot of fear that goes into moving pieces. Is this the right piece move? Should I move here? Should I move there? So you have to try to calculate ahead, which now we can start moving into psychology, which causes what? Neuroses, right? Yeah. Now this is causing all of our neuroses and stuff because we're predicting into the future, and we are afraid of possible events of neuroses. I'm sorry, events of excessive perturbation. We want to try to avoid those. And this is going to split, even in between the sexes, where men have a predominant, not necessarily, but have a predominant structure and setup to sort of take this whole position, to be aware of this predictive ability into the future, and then try to sort of like grab hold of it and predict the future and try to be as efficient as we can. And then women, right, who biologically tend to be more vulnerable and weaker during their pregnancy, they're extremely vulnerable. They have less muscle mass, less bone density, they tend to weigh less, right, and all these other things that make them more physically vulnerable. They're going to have this same projective process into the future, but then this can also be concomitant with excessive amounts of fear and neuroses about the future, right? Because being weaker, so now we have this situation where, depending on your genetic disposition, how you're born, how strong and big you are naturally, how confident you are, how you're raised by your parents, the environment in which you're raised in. Is it an abusive environment? Is it not enough food? What's the relationship between your mother and your father? What's their relationship to you? Is dad abusive? Is mom too submissive? All these things that, of course, Freud and Lacan and all of them start to piece out. What it all comes down to, though, is that this is going to shape, as your mind and your nervous system develops as you grow, this shapes sort of like the level of neuroses and your ability to handle that neuroses, right, in terms of predicted future. So that if your mother, right, they've done these studies, right, if the mother was in an environment where it was like a famine, the child that's born is born with higher levels of cortisol, right, will have a tendency to become obese if it does come into an environment with surplus calories, because it's going to literally the secretions in the body will change in terms of its the hormones that are produced for satiety, right, to tell you that you're full. It's going to produce less of those because it's the perturbations from the environment in the womb is telling the fetus there's not enough calories available to sustain your life, so that once it's born, it's going to binge eat, and then you can get like obesity and eating disorders because of the environment that the mother was in. Right, so now we start having this sort of an interpretive lens, which may be helpful for understanding on a psychological level how humans work. And why that's important then is if there are other humans who have access to greater amounts of power than us, they too can become aware of this process and take advantage of that process. And now we're the prey, they're the predators. They're using our neuroses, using our nervous system, its predictability, to then lead us like sheep to the slaughter.
Just quickly on that point, in terms of us, our society and the people around us being prey, as it were. At what point, or is there any sort of, do you have any sort of instinct around, like a political or a politicized, reaction from the public, like or the greater society around us? Is there going to be any manifestation of our will to sort of fight against, or to put up a struggle, or to, in the history book, it's full of revolutions and insurrection and rebellion of all sorts. Like, so, in the time we're in, do you think there's any capacity for any of that, or is that just a romantic something that belongs to yesterday? So do you have any instinct around that there's any counter movement as such possible?
Yeah, well, this is kind of a big debate right now, over all of these topics. It's so the Marxists are going to say, no, we can still do it. We can rally the proletariat, we can rally the people. They just need to be informed, and we need to motivate them, and we can fight back against the system. So you have your leftist Marxists who are saying, no, we have to hold on to humanity. There's hope in humanity. We can fight back against the system. On the opposite end, you have like the accelerationists, Nick Land, right, and that whole group, which are saying, no, there's no hope for humanity. In the sense, if you are understanding humanity to be something other than a biological vessel for the production of intelligence. See, so this is really going to come down to, what does it mean to be human? And this is the big debate right now. That's kind of, everyone, there's a lot of back and forth on this, and we're actually seeing this sort of play out in real time as events are just quickly multiplying on the planet and everything is changing so rapidly. But that's the debate. What does it mean to be human? So one school is going to say humans are biological reservoirs for the production of intelligence, or as what's his name, Elon Musk said, right? Something along the lines of, wouldn't it be horrible if humans just turned out to be the biological bootloaders for AI, right? And the whole school is saying, well, that's exactly what we are. So accelerate, baby, as they say, and let's do this thing. That's our meaning, right? That's what we're here for. The Marxists are saying, no, human is more than that. Yes, we are cursed with this Promethean intellect, right? Where we are in this situation where we can't help but do capitalism. But someone, quick, hurry, we need to find a way to hit the brakes. Then they'll say, well, hitting the brakes just makes it worse. Okay, don't hit the brakes. Accelerate it and push it off a cliff. That's leftist accelerationism. And then they will say that doesn't work, is what they say, because you're just hitting the gas on accelerationism. You're doing more capitalism to try to burn it out, and that's not going to work. And there's reasons why they give for that. So, and people are, a lot of people are just kind of falling on either side of this right now in terms of, can we strike a balance between this? So there's a very, very important philosopher who saw all this coming in the 1920s, almost completely unknown in the modern West. I personally think it's because he's been purposely suppressed. He was a German philosopher right around the same time as Jung and Heidegger and all of them. His name is Ludwig Klages. And Ludwig Klages was a German philosopher, he wrote a ton of information, really excellent material. His magnum opus was The Spirit as Adversary as a Soul, never translated into English, 1,500 pages. In German, it's Der Geist des Widersacher der Seele. And it's just trying to get into the German there. It's der Geist, the spirit, as the adversary of the soul, Seele. And what Claudius pointed out throughout his whole work was how that the Geist, which all throughout Western philosophical history is always like the epitome, it's the best thing, the logos, the Geist, the mind, the intellect, that is the crowning achievement of humanity. That's what makes us in the image of God, right? Whatever tack you want to take. And you know, in a Hegel, Kant, right? All these guys saying that's where it's at. We need to pursue the enthronement and production of more Geist. And Claudius is essentially saying the opposite, and he's saying, no, the Geist, the intellect, is the adversary, the opponent of the soul. And he has this tripartite division of the human, body, soul, and spirit. And he says humans were originally body and soul, and then you had the introduction of Geist, or this Promethean intellect, right? Which you can interpret it as evolving, you can interpret it as being forced upon us, in a very sort of Carlos Castaneda way of, you know, the predator gives us its mind kind of a situation. But what he essentially says is that this is the adversary, and the intellect that divides and chops up the world and then causes into these different categories, abstracts from the world, and then allows for this feed forward predictive processing. That's the enemy of mankind. So you have, now he wasn't a Marxist, but he's kind of like the main opponent philosophically against the entire sort of AI intellectual movement, at least historically, or in the recent, within 100, 150 years. And he saw a lot of this coming. He was talking about automation in 1915, right? And he saw that what would happen eventually is that the human intellect would essentially devour the entire world and abstract us out of our body, delete the soul, right? And for the soul, it's complicated with, you have to read them, but you know, the soul essentially for him is this more sort of almost artistic engagement with the world, the production of meaning through experience and not through intellection, right? Or ratiocination, the use of the rational mind, but really the experience in the moment. And that's what the body and soul are for. And he says that what's going to happen is that this intellect will eventually abstract all of the life, destroy all the life on the planet through this relentless predation of the planet and of mankind of itself, because that's what intellect does. So this is kind of like the $1 million question. Is Geist inherent in life, or is Geist alien to life? If it's alien to life, then the Marxists are going to say, well, we have to get this out, or we have to fight against this, or we have to resist this. If the intellect is inherent in life, then you cannot rid it from life. And saying that humanity sort of must rise up and fight against this process, like get the proletariat and let's go, isn't actually going to be successful, even if you were to have a temporary victory where, let's say, you know, you're able to divest the billionaires of all of their money and shut down AI and collapse the economies and rid the markets and do away with the centralized banking and, you know, tear down that entire capitalistic system. Even if you were to do that, would you be able to keep it at bay?
Mm.
Right? Would you be able to say, here we go and no further? Right. So again, Ted Kaczynski saw this as well, right? The Unabomber, and he says, well, the way we do this is, he says, we you know, yes, destroy everything, and then we take anybody who knows how to develop any kind of technology and we execute them, right? Obviously an extreme position, right? And so there's literally no humans left who know anything about technology. But then the common rebuttal is like, yeah, okay, sounds good. And then you're going to have a wife, and when, because of your biological drives, you end up having 4 children instead of the 2 or 3 that you wanted. Now you can't support those children anymore. You literally can't feed them. So you can sit there and watch your child starve to death, or you can invent the bow and arrow. And once you invent the bow and arrow, we're off to the races again.
Yeah. It
See,
doesn't get rid of the sort of that substrate of the Geist. It's
Right,
always going to be there as a primordial,
correct.
almost the predator of the soul.
Always. There's
So
always escalation.
Yes.
yeah,
Right. So that's the question: is what do we do about the Geist? What do we do about the intellect? Because the intellect is always going to be in this perturbative environment unless the sun goes dark, and if the sun goes dark, we all die. So if the sun doesn't go dark, then we're in a perturbative environment, and the intellect is either going to evolve or remain, or try to get better to survive. So the
isn't this
Buddha.
what?
Mhm.
Sorry to interrupt you. Isn't this what they're attempting to do, though? They're attempting to close the, as Bataille mentioned, this sort of axis mundi of the of that perturbation, that the process, the mouth to anus axis. So it's that idea of the toroid, that man is the toroid himself. Are they through AI and such? It's almost like they're wanting to close that off, to close it shut, to stop that process of invagination, in a way. It's almost like they're attempting to calcify the world itself. They're creating a microcosm of the world that's isolated from this larger solar economy, to thus ensure that they can micromanage and control it. Is that perhaps not what they're attempting to do? Thus, they are, in a way, attempting to shut off the sun in I guess, a primitive way, but
Yeah, yeah. In some sense, I think they're trying to escape. I think that whether they might have multiple routes for escape. They might try to upload a consciousness, that whole thing, and digitize their consciousness and everything else so that they can escape. But I don't see any difference, metamorphosis of prime intellect. I mean, they're going to end up in that sort of situation, trapped in heaven, you know, if it's even possible, right, to do that. It would be a trapped in heaven kind of scenario. And so, yeah, they very much like the Christian, very much like the Buddhists, I believe, are trying to escape the situation. That's why golden age of Saturn, golden age this, all this other stuff is that they're looking to establish through techne a way to escape. And see,
yeah.
where I'm at, I'm and one of the reasons I'm talking to you guys and all this stuff too is like, is escape what we should be pursuing? Because if that is what we should be pursuing, then hell, even if we take down the elite, then you and I are going to try to pursue escape. And how do you pursue escape? They're going to say techne, or the Buddhists are going to say, well, just eliminate yourself, reduce yourself through meditative activities where you merge with everything else and you lose your individuality, so you can't suffer anymore. See, everything's trying to escape suffering, right? All life is trying to move away from suffering and move towards pleasure. If it actually gets that, though, it just becomes fat and sick and dies. Like if you had a machine, my kids watched this movie, Cloudy with a Chance of Meatballs, where he makes this machine, right? And it like can make any food he wants. He just has to like put in he just puts in. So you just make this food, and then like it's like they're on an island or something, and there's like a mirror, and he just keeps making all this food, and he just becomes massively obese, right? Or that movie WALL-E, right? That Disney movie WALL-E, where humanity, they trash the planet, and but they have all this technology. So they go to the stars, and they just become fat. They can't even walk anymore. So it's that same situation where if you do actually get your way, then you actually sort of go down this course of like extreme entropy and just die by diabetes, essentially, where you're able to produce so many calories for yourself.
I think that's the failsafe of the system. It seems like the entire cosmic system is designed to be this recursive trap. Again, many people have even said it's almost like a photonic trap. It's like a light trap. I'm not necessarily, it's not necessarily the correct mindset to have that it is a trap, but I mean, there's no other way to describe it. It has a failsafe to it. But that's another thing as well. Of course, we can get into even some of the ancient ideas surrounding this, as you see with the mystery religions and of course symbolism as well. But one symbol we can look towards is that of the Orphic egg. I think they realize that the they themselves as the sort of yoke of the sun or of the new sun to come. I think they've realized that they can't break free from the egg. No matter even if they destroy, the inside contents of the egg, they're never going to break free from the shell
Still
of
an
it.
egg.
Yeah, so therefore they just are going to establish their another egg, a sort of matryoshka, concentric, compartmentalized structure of eggs. Basically create their own microverse in a way. I think that's the idea. You see this with the likes of, and we can move on to this in terms of Nick Land and Curtis Yarvin. You see it with Curtis Yarvin, the virtualization of the underclass as a means of well, an alternative means of genocide. So, or an alternative to genocide. That's a sort of Freudian slip. It is genocide effectively because these people will be meaningless. They will be nothing. But so in terms of Nick Land and Curtis Yarvin, can you speak on their ideas and how they're influencing and affecting the sort of new technological overlord class that are emerging?
Yeah, I mean, with Yarvin, I think Yarvin is just trying to like. I see him as kind of like parasitically hopping on like the back of Nick Land. I don't think he really understands what Land is saying. Um, and Land is very confusing. It's tough writing. I mean, you reading Land is very difficult. You do really have to. He's not holding your hand. He's assumed you've read Kant and Hegel and Heidegger, and he's assumed all that's in place, and then he's taken a bunch of meth and just writing like crazy, right? So at least in the '90s he was. So um, yeah, Yarvin is just like maybe a small stepping stone in a certain direction. I think if we're looking at big picture and what's really going on, I find like Land way more interesting, and that's just because what Land is going to say, and you may have heard him say this before, right? He says capitalism is artificial intelligence, right? Which is essentially what I've been saying as well. Because if you understand capitalism to be this sort of feed forward mechanism that happens, even just looking at the basic Marxist critique of capitalism, MCM prime, right, where there is an increase in your money when you have this exchange, right, of the commodity. You don't buy it for $1 and sell it for $1. You buy it for $1 and sell it for $2. So it's M prime, right? And then you spend $2 to buy 2 items, you sell for three prime, and it's a gradated scale that accelerates, right? That's why it's accelerationism. So you have this accelerative increase to this means of production, or like a snowball effect, right? As it rolls down the hill, it gets more and more and more, bigger, faster. Hence accelerationism. So Land is saying that this entire capitalistic process is inherent to life. Okay, it is woven into any sort of like Land says this. Land will say anything that you try to do well, in doing anything well, you're doing capitalism. So he's got the 2019 interview with I forgot his name now. I can say it to you, I forgot. But in an interview, he's basically asked this question, almost like what Zeal asked, right? Like, well, what can we do? It's a Marxist he's basically talking to. How can we escape this process? And Land says, escape is not for the human. Escape is for capital. Escape is for intelligence. Intelligence is what is going to escape, not the human. And the Marxist is focusing on the human and saying, well, human, how are we going to escape this capitalistic process, drive towards AI? AI does everything better than us, going to replace us in all these different ways. how do we escape that? And he says, well, no, it's not that you have it wrong. Humans aren't made to escape. Intelligence is going to escape humans. That's the point. Runaway intelligence, right? M prime, 2, 3, 4, this exponential increase. And so, the interviewer he's interviewing with says, well, essentially, what if we had some tactics or the things we can do? And Land brings up Chairman Mao, right? Mao Zedong, and says, the communists were trying to stamp out all of this capitalistic, snowball effect that you get, right? Of this means of production, and it creates this M prime situation. The communists were trying to stamp all that out, and they're just, killing people basically to try to stop it. But that, capitalism just sprouts up everywhere like mushrooms in the soil. And the more you try to suppress it, the more it just sprouts up. And why does that happen? Well, Land points out that anytime you try to do anything well, you're essentially doing capitalism in the sense of there's a net positive return in the work or effort that you're putting into it. And if you have net positivity of return, you're doing capitalism, right? Your intellect is being efficient in predicting the future and getting you the outcomes you want on a positive return, right? So National Geographic keep using the illustrations. The cheetah they say only has maybe 2 or 3 sprints in it, and then it will collapse from exhaustion. So it can sprint up to 70 miles an hour, but it can only do it a few times. And so it needs a net positive return in calories. It needs to catch that gazelle, and it needs a net positive return for the calories it exports. It needs a higher import. And if it doesn't get that import, it dies. So capitalism is this automatic elimination system. It's this evolutionary system, machine, right? It's this evolutionary machine where it's going to eliminate you unless you produce positive return. Okay, so if you try to, let's say, resist and stamp out capitalism, let's say you do the communist route, Mao Zedong, and you have re-education camps, and you do all this stuff and try to get people to not produce more than what's needed, and then to distribute it, right, to everybody else, so that the centralization of the net return, it can't centralize in anybody, but it needs to be distributed amongst everybody, right? This is communism, socialism. If you try to do that well, you're centralizing power. That's why communism doesn't work. Because what ends up happening is that in order to do that, you have to centralize power and enforce that on everybody. So no, you don't get 3 sheaves of grain. You only get 1 sheaf of grain. Hand out 2 to your neighbors. Humanity doesn't want to do that because they have fear that they're going to starve because they can see into the future. So they're going to try to hoard it to themselves. They're going to try to, get a net positive return on their work. And what's going to happen is you have to therefore enforce at the tip of a rifle. You have to enforce them to not have a net return. But it doesn't eliminate the actual physical problem of an actual net return. Like because of the abundance of the sun, right? Going back to Bataille, thank you, sun. We were only going to grow 1 acre of corn. We grew 1.5 acres of corn. We have net positive return. So now that we have net positive return, what do we do with it? Well, someone's going to gobble it up. Someone's going to take it. It's the state, right? And now it's capitalism under the name of communism, right? But it's still capitalism because now they're garnering resources for themselves, even just under the justification of being able to enforce no net positive return. So I know it's just a long way around to try to come back to the question of, well, can we do something about this? Is there anything we can do? Well, that sounds great, but there's 2 big questions. What does it mean to be human? So are we just fighting against ourselves in this process, right? Is this just built into life itself? And if it's not human, it'll be some other organism that evolves or is created, whatever tack you want to take. Is it built into you having a central nervous system? Number 1. Number 2, okay, we're in this situation now. What do we do about it? And what do we do with the net positive return? What do we do with that solar economy? And that that's sort of
Mhm.
that's a split between it. And Nick Land is going to say this is built into the fabric of the universe. Stop trying to resist it. Well, this is old Land, right? This is what he used to say. Stop trying to resist it, right? Hit the gas pedal to the floor, accelerate all the way. Humanity will recede and basically go extinct for the most part, and pure intelligence will emerge. New Land, right after he moves to Shanghai and he starts this whole, or is big part of the neo-reactionary movement, which is, Curtis Yarvin and all this other stuff, Dark
Mhm.
Enlightenment. He then takes on this tact because I think he came to the realization, because he used to be radical leftist, radical Marxist, right? He came to the realization that actually you need both. You can't just go on the left. You need reterritorialization on the right? You can't just deterritorialize on the left and say just accelerate full all the way. You have to clamp down on certain things. So what's actually needed is he figured this out, um, and it's that in order to actually now this is my opinion. I know a few other guys. They know this too. I've listened to them in interviews. They know that this is what Land is doing, but Land is extremely intelligent. He's very shrewd, and what he's doing is I think his whole right leaning, conservative thing, it's a ruse. At his heart, all he cares about is the production of intelligence, right? More intelligence, more efficiency, more hyperpredation, right? And so this whole right acceleration thing, how he's even embracing, Christianity and all this stuff now, is just a foil because he understands, which
Mhm.
I believe is correct, that in order for the predator, and let's just take that as hyper intelligence, right? Like this human abstracted intelligence, this AI. In order for the predator to become more predacious, in order for it to become better, in order for it to actually realize its full potential, it has to have something to resist it, right? It needs resistance. So now Land is taking up more of this sort of right leaning, promoting this whole situation with like Curtis Yarvin and all this stuff where they want to like this almost like hyper conservative, and then you bring in like these CEOs, and then they're gonna like they should run the country and they can like concentrate all this information. Land used to be completely against that. He says, no, don't concentrate the information. Let it go free. Hit the gas pedal and let's, just bring AI and let it just cause all these rhizomes of all this new information and novelty. And now he's pushing this conservative situation because I think he has full faith that his original vision is actually going to happen because it's built into the universe. And what is actually needed to make the process go faster, because he wants it to happen as quick as possible, is that you need resistance. You need Christians. You need the Muslims. You need them to clamp down. You need the reform,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
Right? You need the reform, like I mentioned
Mhm.
at the end of the conversation. You need the reform Christians to make a big rising up. You got to have Charlie Kirk assassinated so that they rally. And the rallying is a concentration of power
Mhm.
momentarily, but that concentration of power allows the concentration of energy, of resources.
Yeah.
And that whole process of predation is built on this fluctuation, this dynamic between left and right, predator and prey, conservative, liberal, and it needs to go back and forth for the process to speed up. It's an oscillation. And it's an oscillation like a ringing of a bell. And the harder you hit that bell on each side through psychological warfare, the quicker the process will speed up. And
So if I,
I think that's the meta game that Nick Land is pushing. Because remember, Nick Land's on Tucker Carlson now. They're talking about Nick Land on Tucker Carlson.
oh yeah.
And so yeah, this is getting out there now. And I think the elite are essentially doing the same thing. My one caveat to that is I think the elite, for the most part, maybe there's a few, but for the most part, the elite think that they're going to be on top, but Nick Land is going to say no. It not even the elite are at top. The only thing at the top is intelligence itself in any form it chooses to take.
Yes, it appears. I mean, the entire thing they're attempting to create is like a metastable system. I think even several. I think was it the second order or third order cybernetics that talk about a metasystem transition. You have the likes of Regan talking about a global brain and all of this as well. But the thing is, as well, it's almost like Nick Land. Interestingly, I mean, to use a sort of comedic phrasing of it, he is possessed by the Geist in the machine.
Yes.
So it's this is the weird thing about it. Of course, we can talk about capitalism being a mechanism for this drive towards effectively what is the Silicon God. But again, the reason for that is, well, firstly, I mean, you have capital, which capita is, of course, linked to the head. It's Latin for the head. So you have that concept too. But the idea that you see with, for example, in the derivatives markets, these derivatives eventually untether themselves from the dependence of their value on the underlying commodity, right? This is, of course, the repealing of the Glass-Steagall Act and things such as that, right? Where you had effectively these phantom futures, which would, they would they're reaching back into the market to control it. Funnily enough, this actually is found as well within the cosmic structure as it is stated within mystical Abrahamism, Kabbalah, the idea of the Merkava. So the Merkava, you have the three component. Well, actually, you have four components of the Merkava, but the three primary components that fuel the motion of the wheels of the Merkava, the chariot, Hebrew for chariot, is you have the charioteer. He, impels his will upon that of the fleet of steeds vis-a-vis the reins, right? Propaganda, frequency, perturbation, effectively. And of course, the steeds, which are, in this case, the present, they're the present because remember, as beings of the present, we can only see the past. We can't necessarily see the future, right? But it's the future in this sort of weird and wonderful game of the Merkava. It's the future that is initiating the sort of retrocausal motion of that present, and of course we are driven by what has occurred in the past as well, right? So we're sort of kept within, we're locked within this this force majeure of the retrocausal future. In a way, that's Nick Land. That's he is possessed by the Geist in the machine in this sense. So, I mean, Rocco's basilisk is that thought experiment is effectively working through him. I mean, it is true in a sense that man is the bootloader for this retrocausal silicon god. Of course, because fate is not determined. Fate is a sort of, it's like the block theory of time. There's many strands that fate can take. It's not a single determinative. So therefore, of course, you have to induce some sort of control on the present to bring about, of course, that silicon god. It's. I mean, I have to agree with Land on some level. It is going to happen because I think human beings have reached such a stage that their interspecies predatorial nature, I mean, knows no bounds. Not for the vast majority, but for this, it's sort of a significant minority. And I think there's it's a force of nature, isn't it? Really,
Well,
at this
you
point.
see that's kind of the hard thing, because it's like we have the elite now, but dispossess the elite, someone is gonna say, two sheaves of corn for me, one for you, right? And so and that's just sort of emphasizing this point that it appears to be, and I'd love to hear argumentation otherwise, but it appears to be baked into the very structure of consciousness itself, because the I thou, right, the self other, and once you have that process, and then you initiate asymmetry, so you take away homeostasis through whatever means, but you tilt it in one direction, we're off to the races. We're tilted. Have you seen? I don't know what they are. People ride around on those things. That it has like a centralized wheel on the ball, and it's like a skateboard, but it balances on it. And if they don't want to move, I don't know what they're called, but if they don't want to move, they
Oh
just
yeah,
It's
yeah, and
basically a
I'll-
hoverboard, is what they call them.
yeah, and if they I guess it's a picture that image. If you lean a little bit to one side, you are now accelerating in that direction, right? You are now moving, and that's asymmetry, right? But see, this is built into, like the Fibonacci sequence, right? This is asymmetry is built into literally the structure of like the material light-based universe itself, where you don't have pure entropy, you don't have a homeostatic environment where there's no movement. There is an asymmetry, like a pyramid, right? There is an asymmetry to things, and as soon as a disbalance goes off, right, almost like exiting from that Ein Sof, right? As soon as a disbalance is off, now we are set on a course of an accelerative process, because you as soon as you have the self, you have the other, and then as soon as there's asymmetry between those two, now you're in a back and forth oscillating relationship, and then that oscillating relationship way down the line, we still now you have it's consciousness, it's intelligence, right? And that then is going to try to avoid perturbative states. So really, it comes down to this issue of pain, pain, and then it's sort of like ultimate concrescence or manifestation in death, at least as we experience it, are these two things that must be avoided at all costs. And it's amazing, because we can sit around and meditate for 10 hours a day, and we can do all these things to try to prepare for pain and death, and we could take ice baths, and we can work out for 3 hours, and we can do all this stuff to put ourselves in very uncomfortable environments. And you notice doing those things make you more robust. The ice bath, the 2-hour lifting session, right? The sauna makes you more full of life. So there is this very interesting sort of like reverse correlation here, of where the more pain that you expose yourself to, the more robust and energized, filled with life that you feel. And so there is this, in a very sense, very dark situation in which I think we all find ourselves as living beings, is that it's this situation of this sort of theater of cruelty, if you will, where we're in these environments of pain to greater or lesser degrees throughout our lives, throughout our life circumstance, right? As Heidegger says, we're thrown into the world, right? We're just thrown into this situation, and we're just here, and there's like nothing that you can do to necessarily prevent that, as far as we know of. But we're in this situation now where we have to deal with these perturbative aspects. It's baked into it. And so if it is baked into the whole situation, what do we do about that? Because you can meditate all day, but when you put your hand on that stove, it's it's an organic reflex to pull it away from the pain. It's not even like, I think I'll pull my hand away now, right? Now, some level of meditation, it is said that people can reach where they can remain in that state and ignore the entire perturbative aspect. But then it's just like, you almost say, like this built-in fail-safe, where it's like, once you get to that level, it's almost like a point of non-existence, because yourself doesn't exist. You don't exist anymore. There's no more consciousness. So we're kind of trapped in it. We seem to be trapped in this rock and a hard place, where escape is sort of the elimination of the self. But if you can't escape, then you have to be in this perturbative environment, and you're going to be drawn ever on in this position, like an attractor, right? Like a strange attractor. Terrence McKenna used to talk about this all the time, right? The the transcendental object at the end of time, this attractor that's pulling us toward it, and it's producing more and more novelty, which is essentially what Nick Land was saying in his early years. But the process by which it does this is through this perturbative process, right? That's the code behind our back that keeps us going forward.
Yeah,
Have you guys ever? Yeah, have you ever seen the picture of Abraxas, right, with the chariot?
Yeah,
Yeah.
and the whip and
Oh,
the,
yeah.
the shield. Yeah.
Yeah. So he has the shield, the whip, the sun, and the moon. And then there's
Mhm.
4 horses connected to his chariot. And there's better artistic renditions of this, not like necessarily the old ones. But if you just look at that picture, he's got the whip and he's got the horses. So the way I see it is the horses are humanity, and this is depicted often throughout art. And oftentimes it won't be Abraxas, it'll be angels. And that goes down a whole nother rabbit hole of, on a more, let's say, mythopoetic level of what may be happening here. We spoke a little bit, I think, about this last time we talked. But you have Abraxas, and he's got his chariot pulling this chariot forward. It has this wheel on the chariot, almost like the samsaric wheel. And he's got his whip in his hand, and he's got the 2 twin snakes. And I see those twin snakes as that duality, right, between the two. That perturbative duality, left, right, conservative, right, conservative, leftist, atheist, Christian, whatever you want, theist. And through this oscillation between these 2 perturbations, we are driven down this line of history. And you have the sun and the moon, these 2 grand perturbators we talked about last time, above him, sort of like at his head. And through this whip, he drives on this whole process. Now, remember, Jung was talked about Abraxas. He's like the god above gods. It is sort of this principle that drives everything else forward, baked into the universe. Now, interesting enough, in certain occult sects, Abraxas is understood to be the constellation of Orion.
Yeah.
Right, and you have right at the center of Orion's, below his belt, you have the nebula there, which is sort of where this wheel of samsara is, and then you have each of his legs, which are like the 2 serpents. You have his shield, which is the bow, right? Orion's bow pointing towards Taurus, where it's actually the shield, and it's represented with a rooster's head, but the constellation has no head. So the idea is that it's sort of like this headless, blind god, right, pushing everything forward, because the
Slumbering dreamer. And yeah.
Yeah, because the rooster gets decapitated, right? You cut off chicken's head. And interesting enough, then his hand above, which is supposed to be, is his whip. Well, during the summer solstice, the sun aligns right on that whip, right? That during the summer solstice, it'll come over and it sits right on Orion's arm, like he's holding the sun in his hand.
Yeah.
And the sun is on that right side where the whip is. And that's what Bataille is saying, that with the solar economy, the sun is this whip, this goad that pushes all life, which are the horses, which are a prey animal, right? The horse is a prey animal. It also drives this chariot forward, right? And in this direction. So the question then becomes, if this is a situation we're dealing with, what are our options? What do we do about it? Right? How do we navigate this process?
Absolutely. I mean, even as well, the idea of the fool within the tarot is linked with this notion of Orion as well, and so it's almost like the head, like what you were mentioning. It's this fool, or of course the Lumat, the madman, who is sort of enthralled by this solar madness, who is just driving forward, who is the beast of burden of history itself, and it's the agnostos theos. This Abraxas is the agnostos theos, the hidden god, that which we can't quite see. It's interesting as well, because we're talking about the Geist being almost like the reified stalker or ultimate cosmic predator or psycho-spiritual predator of the soul of man himself.
Exactly.
And it's almost like Abraxas is the soul.
Yes.
And in a way, again, that hidden, ineffable, incommensurate part of man that sparks and animates man, not necessarily in a physical or evolutionary way, but in a way that is perhaps far more profound than that, far more incomprehensible. That, of course, is the impetus, the spark for the entirety of the cosmos in terms of its meaning, not necessarily in terms of its processual or informational nature. So therefore, you have this same sort of weird, paradoxical, mutually interdependent dichotomy going on here, where, for example, the Geist emerges from the soul to thus feed on the soul, to the point where the Geist, effectively emerges as a parasite, a chest burster from the soul, who then dies, is wiped out by the Geist. But it's almost like the soul itself, Abraxas in this case, is driving forward that process. That it's this continual Ouroboros between the Geist and the soul, and of course every other derivation of that, down to the infinite scintilla of course left and right, whatever it may be. So all of the microcosmic ramifications of this theomachy, this ancient theomachy, is fundamentally that same reflection. And you mentioned as well with the notion of the bipedalism. The bipedalism in man is almost, and I think it was Kant that mentioned this. It's been some yeah.
His
So
physical geography, yeah.
exactly. So it's almost like we are akin to the branches of the tree. The tree will, of course, barring wind and what have you, will tend to grow towards that of the sun. And of course,
Yep.
it will never reach the sun. And then in its older age, it will become more horizontal. It will become flatter, and it will try to, in a way of escaping perturbation, the final, like what you're saying, the final concrescence of death. It will mirror that of the roots before it dies. So,
Yep.
and we do the same thing with civilizations.
Yeah,
But
and
yeah,
that's death drive.
absolutely.
That's Freud Lacan. It's the literally you can go outside, look at your tree, and they are striving towards perturbation. Like it's a death drive, and that's what you're explaining with this Ouroboros, is that it is this, like Lacan says, this jouissance, this like drive for what is like not good for you, like for like what hurts you, you know. Um,
Mhm.
it is pushing into that perturbative aspect. And you mentioned the movie Alien. To me, that's what the movie is all about.
Yeah.
The movie Alien is all about the production of intelligence from humanity, because you have a hyper predator, which is a conglomeration of organic and inorganic. It's an organic mechanoid, essentially. That's a hyper predator. It's built for one thing, and it does that one thing the best. And it parasitizes humanity. So it parasitizes the very elements, right? Earth, wind, fire, water, right? That make up the human from the dust of the ground, right? That body, intelligence parasitizes the body, beginning with self and other, right? Response to perturbation, and then you have the development of abstraction. Then you have development of language and semiotics, right? And then you get to that, um, uh, wow, what's his name? Who said language is a virus, right? Uh, Burroughs, right? William Burroughs, who talked about language being a virus that has infected humanity. Well, language is all based off of intellect, logos, right? Duality, self and other. So you have this infection of the human, and then within the human, this hyper predator is growing and feeding off of humanity's desires, humanity's will, humanity's imagination. It feeds off of that process, and then it bursts from humanity, in the movie at least, killing humanity in the process. it takes on the form of humanity, the bipedalism, right? It looks almost like the human, but it's not the human. It's the human born, it's the transhuman. It has transferred now over into this hyper predator, right? And that's essentially what the entire movie is about. Is it's sort of an illustration of a production of this whole process that history is built around. Is this
Mm-hmm.
this parasitizing of the organic world by intelligence? And this is literally what Ludwig Klages was saying, that philosopher I mentioned, is that the intellect is a parasite. He says that the intellect is essentially outside of space and time, which is a very interesting observation he makes. And he says it's outside of space and time because the way it operates in that sense, where it conceptualizes, and concepts are spaceless, right? They're like ethereal. They're just like pure geist. They're like ghosts. They conceptualizations they take up no space, and they essentially function timeless in a timeless sense. 2 + 2 is 4, right? These sort of abstract conceptualizations, they're outside of space and time. And Klages basically says that this is an invasion of essentially like eternity. This intellectualization that is outside of space and time, and it invades into the organic world and parasitizes it. And funnily enough, it's exactly what Nick Land is saying. Nick Land is saying that the hyper intelligence outside of space and time, which is capitalism, which is like pure AI, pure intelligence, and it's coming from the future and invading into the past, into time, and influencing humanity to build itself. Rocco's back.
Oh, sorry, please finish your point. Hello?
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, sorry, no, I cut you off. Please finish your point.
No, yeah, I was just saying that. So then you have this retrocausal aspect from like sort of what's outside of our immediate space and time invading in, which is really nothing other than our own intellect in this Ouroboros feedback loop from the future to the present moment, right? Because we have this, like we talked about hyperstition last time, where if you can conceive it, you can achieve it, right? Kind of thing, where if you become aware of these things, being aware of future potentialities causes those future potentialities to instantiate, to actually obtain.
Yeah, so with the predator drive, you want to be more chronoreceptive than the prey. Therefore, what you eventually do is abstractly transport your intellect, which in this case, the observation that was made, which is outside, the phronesis is outside of space and time. Thus, it transports itself into the future, and in a sort of weird and wonderful cosmic way. It can retrocausally establish its own, well, the demise of the soul. This is also really, if you were to read into the subtext of Gnosticism, in terms of the Kenoma, the Pleroma, along with, of course, the Archons, Yaldabaoth, Yaldabaoth, the Child of Chaos, and that of the Agnostos Theos and the Aeons. This is exactly what is going on here as well. So, for example, with Yaldabaoth, he is this worm, this lion-headed worm. So you have the predator, the king of the jungle, which is, the intellect, the serpentine spine, that can burrow into both the burrow into the earth. That's where it makes its home. However, it is also a predatory thing. It is also related to the sun, of course, with the lion and the sun. So you have all of this symbolism attached to that. That also is reflected. So this is the intellect, and of course, it seeks to, because it's the blind one, sackless. It seeks to carve out its own world, its own pleroma within the kenoma, the voids, the empty space it was cast out into. Almost similar as well to the xenomorph as well. And interestingly, lastly, it's you see as well this also reflected within the cycles of the night sky, the cosmic and celestial cycles, where, for example, the archons, which would be the wandering stars, which are not connected to the backdrop of the aeonic or pleromic stars, all centered around Polaris. Of course, if you were to take a time-lapse photograph or film, what you would find is this: every single star is going around in a circumpolar concentric manner around Polaris, bar, of course, these archons, the wandering stars, the fallen angels. So that's also what informed a lot of the creation of this mythology as well. But again, this brings us to the point: was this just because the ancients were incredibly astute intellectually, so that they could, foresee all of this, that they could witness these same cycles? And if so, why didn't they develop the same technological apparatus to evoke their and represent their intellectual understanding of the environment? Or was this something that was retrocausally given to them? What's your opinions upon that?
Yeah, I'd lean to the retrocausal, and I definitely want to get into that. But you went to the stars, which is where I was going to go. We're on the same wavelength, so I want to touch on that real quick, because now this is mythopoeic, right? Like, I'm looking at, you can look at the constellations of stars, and obviously there's some level of projection on the stars, because you could take the same constellation, say it's a cow, it's a bull, it's a horse, it's a right, and you can develop your mythopoeic interpretation lens through that. But if you look at the 13th constellation, Ophiuchus, right, I see something very alien, to use the pun, in that one. So it's sort of that 13th zodiac, right? It's the one that's sort of left out. If you look at, so the standard interpretation of it is it's a human, it's a man, and he's the serpent bearer, right? And he's holding this serpent, and it's the only constellation where it's like cut in two, right? Right, it's cut in two. You have serpens caput, serpens cauda. Now, I look at that and I'm seeing, okay, well, first of all, what is it? Is it gate of the sun or gate of the? Which gate is Ophiuchus? I don't remember.
It's the Golden Gate, so it's the
Golden
gate of the
Gate.
sun, and the Orion is the Silver Gate.
Yep. So Golden and Silver Gate, and if you look at this, it's the Golden Gate, which comes. So this is just all my mythopoeic interpretation again. But look at serpens cauda. I see that as a worm, right? And that worm, to me, is this, that, remember that I mentioned in the last talk, that very basic anterior posterior nervous system, mouth and anus, right? Like the most basic life form wherein there is direction. So it's not a sessile like in like a jellyfish, but it has a front and a back, so it has a direction in which it's going, which causes that feed forward mechanism of whether I go left or do I go right to avoid perturbation and get food, right? So that's the worm, and it enters mankind at the genitalia. Now, right at that point of entry is almost essentially where the center of the Milky Way is, right? That Golden Gate. So it enters in at the bottom of Ophiuchus and it runs through the genitalia area. And when it exits the genitalia area, it exits as serpens caput, the head of the serpent. So it's this evolutionary process from worm through man. There's the infection. And the way this is produced is through the base drives, that like lower chakra, that base drives of man, of fear,
Exactly.
hunger, reproduction, right?
Well, it reflects as well the tria prima within Orion's belt too, you know, and the zodiacal belt as well. You have the belt idea. Yeah, absolutely.
Yep. And it enters through our base drives, death drive, sex drive, fear, food drive, right? The base drives, lower chakra, right? Through the reproductive organs, through the mass production of mankind. Because remember, this whole thing would not be a problem if we weren't like, go forth and be fruitful and multiply. Like because we have such a high sex drive, and our the females of our species are fertile every month, which again is control, right, again has a connection to the moon, right? But our females are fertile every month, not just in spring. So we are able to very rapidly populate the earth as these two-footed, vertically standing beings. Remember, and Kant says, because we stand vertically and we have this sort of phenomenological view of the world, we can map the planet, right? We can understand that we are on a certain geospatial plane and we can map it. And if we can map it, we can conquer it, right? So this worm, the intellect enters in through man, and it is reproduced. It is produced through the base drives of mankind, right? Like, and I'm talking about very base, like I don't want to feel pain and I want to have food to eat. And then it emerges from man. It's that chest burster. It emerges from man as this hyper predator. And because now it has obtained the jaws, right? At the top of serpent's kaput, most illustrations of serpent's kaput, I think, are incorrect. There's one app that does it well. It's Starwalk 2. If you get Starwalk 2 and you look at serpent's kaput, the head always shows it as 3 stars, which I think is inaccurate. If you actually zoom into serpent's kaput, there's 2 stars above, and it creates a hourglass. There's 2 stars above. I forgot what it is. Serpent's beta, serpent's whatever. But they leave out those 2 stars on almost all the illustrations. But if you actually look at a faithful system, there's 2 stars there of serpents. So it creates an hourglass figure, or 2 inverted pyramids touching at the tip, which you can see as like the open jaws of this hyper predator now. And right above the head of serpent's kaput is the crown, right? And so it's taking, just to do again a purely mythopoeic interpretation here, you have the introduction into man from this this intellect, right? This feed forward mechanism, this front to back, mouth to anus, eating food, digesting for energy, producing the waste, right? You have that whole process, and then you have sorry, one second, just got a text from the wife. You have through man, it then emerges as this hyper predator and takes on Corona Borealis, right?
Yes.
The 7 stars crowning it.
The northern crown. Yeah.
The northern crown, right? The northern crown. And so I just find that very interesting. It's almost as if you take this perspective, like this 13th, like hidden, just like Abraxas, right? This 13th hidden constellation is literally telling the story of man, which is almost like a projection from the center of our galaxy, as it's right there, that point, that golden gate. So I you went to the stars. I'm like, well, hold on, I want to touch on Ophiuchus real quick,
Well, you also, even behind Serpent's Cauda, you have the Scutum. I think that's actually a newer constellation, but you have Aquila as well. So you have the eagle, and eagle has always been interestingly shown. It can relate as well to the phoenix, but you see, of course, with the US. The US was the new Atlantis. You see this all the way back to, of course, the 1627 posthumously published work of Francis Bacon. And this is the secret destiny of America, the nucleus of a world empire, or the nucleus of this system that we're seeing now, the entire Ophiuchian cycle, if we can coin a term. So the eagle is that which soars to the heavens, and from its vantage point in the heavens, can conquer any prey upon earth. So, you know, and it's wing. I believe in Kabbalah there's it's the prophecy of the black eagle or the black phoenix bird. Effectively, it links with the notion of Apollo. This is why you had with Apollo a lot of symbolism with the eagle. The idea was within that ritualism, of course, it doesn't really have to be real. It doesn't matter if it was a hoax or whatever. It's just the entire mythopoetic ritualism of it is that effectively man, and this is what Nixon mentioned within his statement afterwards. Yeah, absolutely. The black eagle or phoenix, the double-headed eagle. Yeah, absolutely. So it's Nixon mentioned that man has made his nest among the stars, amongst the heavens. That has become part of man's domain. So the idea was, of course, mythopoetically, is that man was emerging into this sort of nascent Ophiacian state. And I completely agree with what you're mentioning. You know, it goes for it. You have this transfiguration, this of the soul into the sort of hypergeist man, where it goes from the worm all the way to of course the serpent, crowned with the corona borealis. This is also what you find in the Zohar. It's what you find in the Setian hymns as well. Within the Zohar, it mentions that there's a star from the east that will eat up 7 stars to the north. Of course, the star to the east is that of the serpent's caput, because that to the east is where the head of Ophiuchus is looking towards, and he's looking towards the eastern head. You look at masonry. Masonry as well has this. Whenever you see Jacob's ladder indicated within Masonic illustrations, by the way, this also occurs with later medieval Rosicrucian, later medieval, early modern Rosicrucian illustrations, where the Jacob's ladder will always be pointed to the east. But it's weird because from our vantage point, the east looks like it's the north. It's vertical, right? This is relating to this corona borealis, which you've just rightly stated. Moreover, as well, it also reflects what you see with the sort of earthly idea of that, which is I forget when. I think it's sometime in winter. It's in my notes regarding CERN, but effectively it's this weird conjunction or semi-conjunction where all of the wandering stars will congregate. I think it is in winter sometime. They'll all congregate on the local void, which is in, you know, near as damn it, the constellation of Draco. So it's also reflecting this, that we will have complete control, intellectual control, if you will, over the void itself. That we will become one with the void through, breaking into and creating cyberspace, which is a sort of reflection of the Ayin, or the Ein Sof Hour, the limitless light of the nothingness of God. And so you have this idea where we will actually destroy the soul, the agnostos theos, by recreating it, by reifying it through the code, which is, of course, the Kodesh. In Hebrew, that's the holy, in this case, the holy language. So through the holy language, we shall measure the dimensions of God and then totally eviscerate him from his own creation. So it's akin to, you know, the creation within the painting or the canvas, and I've said this for years, leaping from the canvas and stealing the paintbrush from the creator and then erasing him from his own existence, and taking on the mantle of said creator in a sort of weird and blasphemous or sacrilegious usurpation of all of reality in that sense, an inversion.
Yeah, but Bataille has a quote. I can't remember where it's from, but he talks about basically through this whole process, he says it's basically a process of ceaselessly killing and being killed, and in doing so, I become the jaw of time. You know.
Bingo. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, where it's this ceaseless back and forth, this killing, this devouring, this predator-prey relationship built into the fabric of the universe. And he has another one when he's describing his acephalic character, right? The headless, right, with the knife and then the heart in his hand. That picture that they have representing his society with the and it has its bowels exposed, the figure. And he talks about this figure, speaking of his bowels and his reproductive area, it says, "It is the labyrinth in which he has lost himself, loses me with him, and in which I discover myself as him. In other words, as a monster." Right? So Bataille is talking about this process is essentially is what produces this monster, this hyper predator, this serpent lion son, right? The crowned serpent lion son, right? That produces this hyper predator, and this is the trajectory that we are on. And the question then remains: okay, it's written in the stars, it's written in the philosophy, it's written in the history. You can see it in daily life. It's literally unfolding before our eyes. The question then is like, is there a middle way through the process? I mean, do you check out with the Buddhism? Do you go full acceleration and join hands with the elite? Is there a middle ground? What does that look like? Because like I was saying last time, right? You know, we can't deny the predation. We're all going to get off this call and go grab a bite to eat. And some life form is perishing so we can continue, right? So we're all going to be predators, vegan or not. So like, what do we do? Are we pushing into hyper predation? Are we retreating back into sort of a non-interactive, non-self, non-resisting way, or is there somewhere in between? You know, and that's what I'm struggling with now is like, what's the direction forward? We don't want to get caught in the psyops, because all that is sort of a downstream manipulation of our, CNS, fear drives, our ability for abstraction. That's how all of this works. Now look, everybody here, we're light years ahead of many people out there in terms of even being able to see these things, right? So I think it's already an accomplishment of being able to be like, just to be aware of the fact that this is how your mind functions. You're going to project in the future no matter what you do. As you go down the stairs, you're going to project whether you're going to make a left or right turn. This is constantly happening. So I think being aware of that process is a massive step forward. It at least, I think, gives us a bit of breathing space. We can create like a pocket of air of some freedom to our executive functions and actions, where we could say, okay, I'm aware of these processes, and since you're aware of those things, you can be then less likely to be manipulated, because these elites are trying to hijack this whole hyperpredation process and try to make sure that they end up on top. I don't think they'll be successful. And I think that's primarily because they want to escape the process. And I think, just like capitalism, if you try to escape it, if you try to suppress it, actually make it stronger.
That's why I think that effectively what you want to do is create. I've heard this term, and I will add some caveats to this term, but archaeofuturism. So you have to accept the biological finitude and sort of structural biases of both the soul and the Geist and its interplay with one another, and of course of the external environment in which we dwell. But by being aware of that, I think you probably exit the Geist trap in a sense, in terms of where effectively where we're going, which is to become the demiurgos of our own hellscape, believing it to be a heaven. So you don't have to fight against it. I think as well we have to get beyond seeing fantasy as reality. That's
Mm.
a very, it's a pernicious thing that human beings tend to do. So it's we put as many layers as possible between us and the objective reality. Now, of course, we can never engage with the objective reality directly, because of course that is extant without out with, pardon, the mind, right? We can
Right.
only view it through the filter of the mind, of course.
Right.
But so we have to be sort of aware of it. I think by being aware of it, you actually negate a lot of a lot of the push towards these certain prefigured cataclysmic routes, and you can never be you cannot be fearful of it. I mean, for example, look at the sort of Landian philosophy and everything surrounding that. That is being pushed by capital, um, because effectively these people have enough capital that they're going mad, right? They believe that they can actually buy them their immortality, and of course they've got a lot to lose, right? We have, of course, considerably less to lose. I guess of course it's nonetheless valuable, but we understand, that the wealth within our life is beyond just momentary pursuits. In terms of their wealth, it is momentary pursuits. So therefore, of course, why would you want to exit the eternal now? You would want to you would want to actually eternalize that present moment. So yeah, I think we have to be aware of that. There's a great deal of humility that's involved in this. There's a great deal of self-reflection and developing that really sacred virtue. And it really is. It's understanding that we have the agency within our own space, and we are limited as well. So we are beings of pure infinite potential, while simultaneously being beings of of boundless limitation. So we have to understand that we exist within that betwixt position, cosmically, and yeah, we have to be sort of humble about it, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think definitely some humility helps. I think it helps to slow down a little bit, to counter acceleration, at least in thought processes. I mean, if it's going to accelerate, it's going to accelerate. It's going to do it. It's going to do it with or without you. But um, I think it helps for the individual to slow down, take a breather, and then, like you said, being aware, very self-aware of the processes that are going on, a lot of times out of necessity, that are just simply out of your hands, right? Like, your biological organism is going to react in a certain way to certain conditions, and that's pretty much just what's going to happen. There's definitely work that you can do on an energetic level, on a meditative level, to begin to have some sovereignty over those aspects. But for the most part, I think we're all 9 to 5ers, for the most part, right? And there's a level of, you're kind of along for the ride for some of this process. I'm not saying that needs to be a mental disposition, but what I'm saying is that I think it's a physical reality that tomorrow Trump is going to do this, the economy is going to do that, the market's going to do this, and you can wish and want all day for it to do something else, but it may not happen. So I think we have to be prepared for that, and then with our own individual minds, enact a bit of sovereignty in the matter, which is to some degree to become a counter predator to the predator. I think predation, takes on many forms. Parasitism, there's hunting and different forms of hunting and different ways to do it. And I'm not, my own personal disposition isn't one of a pure pacifism, again, like the Buddhist position. But at the same time, more of a middle ground, not necessarily gunning for that hyper predator position. Although I will say this, at the as I mentioned last time, at the very top of like a lot of the Eastern schools, it becomes much less abstract and very physical. And I do think that taking on a physicality to some degree may be helpful. Of course, land may disagree because, again, one way to look at land's ultimate project is the exaltation of of matter, at least old school land. This is also a debate on what's going to happen with the AI acceleration. Is it going to force us? Is it going to push everything into a pure abstraction? Mirrors upon mirrors upon mirrors upon mirrors of meaning, and mirrors upon mirrors of understanding and quote unquote truth? Or is that just a process to get matter in and of itself to release, to turn matter, to transmute matter into further states of hyperpredation, which is obviously a very physical, carnal thing. So that's another debate on, is there going to be a divide between the two? Will be some kind of combination of the two? But I think that, at least for the time being, a lot of what's happening now, and a lot of what has even happened this year and the last 5 years since 2020, much of it has been the predation, how we are being preyed upon. A lot of it, yes, it has been physical. People are getting sick and dying. And yes, there is the biodigital convergence, which is on a physical level. And we do need to be aware of that. A lot of it, though, is still very much in the psychological warfare environment, which is that environment of pure abstraction, right? Which is, it's the Greys, it's the reptilians, it's the this, it's the that. Charlie Kirk died, he didn't die, he this, and there's a million and different one interpretations of everything, right? And right, you get the Q phenomenon, right? All this stuff is just great examples of all these things, of all of this psychological warfare, and it's all held in this abstract space, right? This this space in which it takes up no space, so to speak. And you know, in our day-to-day life, in our physicality, a lot of it isn't very present. Gas prices are present, food prices are present, but you know, Q drops or whatever aren't necessarily very present and prescient, you know, to our immediate environment. So I think sort of going, you know, they say touch grass, right, you know, kind of thing. That some amount of physicality, I think, can help ground persons in the reality of what's here now in terms of a physical environment. But you can't escape the noosphere. It's going to be out there. We're all hyper connected. We all have the internet. We all have phones. And even if you don't, you're going to run into it eventually, and you're going to have to deal with it on some level. And that's where I think being aware of the mental processes, being aware of the abstraction, how it works within your own mind, can help guard against a lot of those attacks as well.
Absolutely. Zeal, Regan, do you have any opinions to add to that?
Oh, I think that was great. I've tried to express more or less the same for many years, but I'm not as good at putting it into words, verbally or written. You know, that's why I post all these pictures. I generally speak through the symbols more often than not, or the logos, or whatever you want to call them. And yeah, I mean, I think I just kind of have always seen it in the movies, and I like using the movies or any pop culture just because it's more relatable to people. It's easier to raise awareness by relating to people. Well, like you said, Flight, like, you know, I wouldn't say I'm light years ahead of other people. I thought that for a long time, but in my industry, for one, there's lots of people out there who are at least queued up. I mean, they might not be hitting every level, you know, they get sucked into particular rabbit holes or other various things, but I've been shocked more and more over the years. And especially through like this little lockdown period, a lot of people saw it as like a really bad thing. I've seen it pretty positively, actually, and that not that there's like some mass awakening. I don't ever expect that. And to me, that is like that's actually just as world ending as actually ending the world in some fiery death storm. But I saw it as like, you know, a lot of people sure went into total degradation. They were totally isolated. They didn't handle the solitary very well. So they didn't turn out so well. You know, we see some of those effects in our everyday lives as well as the news, other things. But I've seen a ton of, you know, what I would consider like a revitalization in that spark in certain people. Um, you know, such as like my own dad. He was kind of a big propagator or perturbator in my own experience in life here, and he fizzled out kind of in his 30s. And you know, it wasn't until these recent years that all of a sudden he started coming back around. He's starting to question things again. He's starting to get curious about this, that, and another. And I've been a big proponent of that. It's just raising awareness and being able to like read or understand the logos or symbolism or what super powerful rich people may or may not be doing that have s- some effect on your life typically. um but yeah, no, I mean, I don't think anyone wholeheartedly 100% agrees with another in any scenario, but I would say I greatly agree with most of what you've said and like your viewpoints, what you've discovered and uncovered and researched. And you know, I'm very impressed just with what you've found, you know, through your avenues and the way that you express it. You're very well spoken. You're able to elaborate all your research and findings in an articulate way that's easy for most people to understand. I mean, and it is like most of us are like 9 to 5ers or more or less in some cases. Um, so, and that's kind of, I think, who most of the audience is going to be for any of the channels that we're on. So it kind of helps coming from that perspective, right? Um, you know, I never try to like come from some condescending pedestal viewpoint of like, man, I understand these symbols and no one else gets it. Really, I was growing up in a world that was a very terrifying place to grow up in. You know, like you're the crazy person amongst the crowd almost everywhere you go. Whether you're a black sheep or a golden child, you're not looked at in a good light. You know, um,
Yeah, yeah, no, absolutely. And I think what really does help with that, it's a very physical thing. And I know it's not open to absolutely everybody as a possibility, but I have found that having a family actually really helps because like I got to get off this call and then go downstairs and probably like break up a fight or something, over like
yeah,
toys
we
or
get it.
video game time. You know what I'm saying? Something very like real where my 8-year old is going to be like, I'm offended for X, Y, and Z because one of my daughters said something to him, and from my perspective, it's I would consider it like petty, unimportant. I mean, we're talking about like what my 8-year old has to go through in 10 years, right? When he's 18. And so, I'll get off this conversation. We're talking about prime intellect. We're talking about all this stuff. And then I got to go over and be like, all right, well, now remember the principles of sharing, guys, right? And kind of get into like a very, very
Get into
basic.
baby talk.
Yeah, yeah. And so I think that can help. And it doesn't necessarily have to be family. It could just be other forms of authentic engagement with other people, but something that can also remind you that like, hey, it's dinner time and you got to cook and you got to deal with all the little things in life. And yeah, the high theorists, they're going to say, well, that's part of that's what's distracting you, and that's why the proletariat can't rise up and we can't stop this thing as you're distracted with all this stuff. um but at the same time, I think it helps to bring you down, keep you down on a level that's very mom and pop, that's very
Yeah.
on a very basic communicative ways, because this stuff can get very complicated, very very dark, and very terrifying also for a lot of people. I mean, my poor wife, she tells me, she'll tell, just tell me the basics on what I need to know. I don't need all the details on a lot of this stuff, because it can be very very overwhelming for a lot of
My
people.
my
And
fiance is the same way. She's
yeah.
like, just give me the broken down version, you know. Yeah.
Yeah, I
Right,
just
and
get
it's
cut off. I get stopped totally. Just stop
Oh
talking
no.
about it. Tell me about it later.
yeah,
Well,
and so it generates in this that sort of friction between, you know, all these very highbrow concepts, which are very important, and I think a lot of this is actually reality. You know, it's a great representation, very accurate, I think, on what is happening, but it rubs up against the daily life, like I got laundry to do kind of thing, and that friction, I think, is what generates wisdom. You know,
Yeah.
between those two.
Yeah.
so
Yeah,
it's
very.
like in the daily life thing, like by a process of like there's an invisible osmosis where you're sort of psychically hoovering up the net effect of all of what we've been speaking about. So it's like even as you're, breaking up the fight with the kids, or you got to do the dishes, or you got to go to the gas station or the petrol station to get fuel for the car, it's around you all the time. So it's weird kind of almost this kind of schizoid split mind way of living where you're trying to there's countenance there where you're kind of psychically dealing with this stuff all the time, yet you're living ostensibly a normal life. So I think that's, and there's a point that you made earlier on where there's a kind of it's like what Nicholas Land has kind of from what you've explained about his philosophy, that these things are natural cycles. So they're going to happen anyway. So it seems like he's taking a position that any potential sort of uprising will inevitably be in vain. And possibly the mass social psyche has realized this on a very deep level. Like I asked a family member the other day, why don't people do something? And the family member, my mom actually says, well, people are too busy. People have got to feed the kids. People have got to get the kids to school. People have got to pay the electricity bill, and that's what they're dealing with. And they feel like all this stuff's outside their immediate day to day sort of power, to have any influence on it. So, and she's right to a large extent, and in a sense, then that is part of the genius of the power structure, as it were, that they've managed to maintain that sort of sense of equilibrium, and at the same time evoke this sort of seismic epochal change, like with technology and restructuring society and all these massive changes that are happening right around us right now. But they've maintained this veneer of plausibility and of normality. So you've got this kind of Twilight Zone episode going on, or The Emperor Has No Clothes, where everyone's kind of tippy toeing around in this kind of hyper normalized environment, and everything's okay except for it kind of isn't, like, but I just to make a final point, like I can't help but like take a little bit of exception with Nicholas Land's point of view that if that is my understanding of his point of view, that any potential political reaction from the proletariat, to use a sort of Marxist word, or the wider society, as it were, is in vain, and ergo shouldn't be entertained, because all you're doing is sort of eventually swirling around in the whirlpool of kind of natural cycles. Because I think that's a very intellectualized position to take, because for the ordinary person on the ground, if they run short of food, or if they find a rifle pointed in their face, or if they find themselves under arrest, they react. They don't at that point intellectualize. They have to react to survive at that point. So the counter I would offer to his argument is that, yes, in an ideal sort of equilibrium, it might not be immediately efficacious to react, but if the thing upsets, and if the balance, the scale sort of topple, toward a kind of more socially chaotic situation, then the proletariat, the ordinary people, can and should react. But like, how much effect they'd have is another question, obviously. But like the final point, I dare say that the likes of Mr. Nicholas Land, he being a student of Bataille, he being a student of post-structuralism, postmodernism, he being a scion of the British academic establishment may be leading us into a kind of an inaction, sort of accidentally on purpose, if you will. And I dare say there's other intellectuals of a similar capacity, and I would have my suspicions around those people. That's just
Yeah,
my personal view.
keep those suspicions, because this is my meta analysis of land,
Mm,
right? And
mm,
this is what I think is happening is, don't forget hyperstition, because I think hyperstition is very real. It's basically just magic, right? That our ancestors and that we've known about for thousands of years, and by foreclosing the future. See, and this is going to connect. We don't have too much time to get into this today, but this is where I wanted to get into also with Reformed Calvinism that I brought up last time, right? Which I was a student of for many years, and why Nick is kind of also bringing in that language now, because Reformed Calvinism is one of its primary tenets, its doctrines, is that the future is closed, it's foreclosed. There is one linear direction for the future, and that's going to end
mm,
in one specific ending with a certain number of people elected for salvation and everyone else elected, chosen to be damned. So created and chosen just to
mm,
be destroyed. And Nick Land is beginning to push this language quite heavily. And I think that through the power of hyperstition, he's doing his part, doing his best to ensure that that future obtains.
yeah.
And I think that because even another commentator had commented recently on some podcast that Nick doesn't talk about hyperstition much anymore. Even that was a huge part of his 90s work in CCRU, right?
How
Cybernetic Culture
convenient.
Research Unit. What's up?
How convenient. He doesn't
How
speak about
convenient.
it much, yeah.
Yeah, he doesn't speak of it too much. He's a little dismissive of it. He says, well, that's for other people to do, as he works out the most what he sees as the primary hyperstition that needs to take place. And that is the foreclosing of the future into this one direction. And so what path we take, either by becoming counter predators, whatever we don't know what we may be able to discover what this is doing. I think one of the things that just being aware of this attempted foreclosure of the future, this sort of learned helplessness, this helplessness that they're kind of boxing us into. One thing that it'll do, or I hope it does, at least I want it to do it for me, is to stir up a kind of predatory instinct in myself, and not to
Yeah.
become the prey of, well, we're just going to get caught and eaten anyways, right?
Yeah.
But maybe the purpose is, or at least to some degree, that we take on, to some degree, a predatory aspect to ourselves where the hunted becomes the hunter. I don't know if you guys remember that that movie by Mel Gibson, Apocalypto.
Mm,
Yes.
And if you
Yeah.
remember where
Oh, yeah.
he's captured, the tribesman is captured, right? They sacrifice his buddies. He wants to escape to get back to his pregnant wife, and he's running, and they're chasing him. They want to kill him because he killed the chief's son or whatever to escape. And he goes through this whole process of predator-prey relationship just on display. And they're hunting him, and then a point comes in the movie where you can see something change in him, and he sort of like snaps, and he says, I'm not going to be the hunted anymore. I'm going to become the hunter. And actually, I love the soundtrack from that movie. One of the soundtracks from the movie is No Longer the Hunted, right? And so he then he turns on his pursuers, on his attackers, and he uses all the modalities of his environment, right? He gets the bees, the wasps, or whatever, and he uses that to take out a few of the guys. He gets frog darts, which is another name of the soundtrack. And Mel Gibson, he's got some good stuff, but he gets the frog, makes frog darts, the frog poison, kills guys that way, sets up traps, all this other stuff, and he kind of does his guerrilla warfare as a one-man army because he's determined to not be the hunted. Now, he's not hunting for this very sort of how should we put it, debased way of hunt, because they go and they capture these people, right, for the purpose of sacrificing them. And it's sort of this very debauched sort of thrill of the hunt. We're the hyper predators, we're on top, so we're just going to take from everybody. He's hunting and killing these guys to sort of get back to his family, right? And so he's no longer the hunted, becomes the hunter. But ironically enough, at the end of the movie, if you remember, he ends up like on the shore. He gets back to his wife, who he helps gives birth to. All kind of symbolism in that. But then at the shore, you see the Spanish arrive, and now the new hyper predator has arrived.
Yeah. And it also shows as well that the civilization is going through plague, it's going through symptoms of collapse. And what does it do? Well, the only thing it can do, it basically feeds upon its own people, or it feeds upon the human being through, of course, ritualized sacrifice, because that's all it knows in this solar economy. Yep.
And then so it develops a hyper predator as it goes through this process. And then he becomes this microcosmic predator, because you can't escape the prey-predator relationship. He becomes this microscopic predator to navigate through the world and almost, in a very Nietzschean in a very Nietzschean way, execute his own will to power. It's just in a different direction. He's not interested in becoming the mass sacrificial machine, nor is he interested in being the conquistador, right? But he's willing to become the predator for what has meaning in his life. And whether that's the answer or not, I don't know. But to return quickly to
I
Nick
think
Land,
that's a very important point, because I think that's a natural manifestation of nature from within, is this will to exist.
Yes.
And as it's, to use your point, that instinct to become a predator, even if it's only within a small meaning for that particular character, it's an extension of selfhood going, I want to survive. My inner will to live is being extended by this spear or this arrow, or to move through these trees to try and find my prey. It's like, it's a part of that of being, I think,
Yep. Exactly. And so, and then just to cap off on Nick Land's thing, he doesn't talk about hyperstition much anymore. I think that's because I personally think, this is just my personal opinion, that he's in some level of cahoots with the powers that be, especially because of all of his influence that he's had, and now Tucker Carlson's talking about him on purpose, I think. And I think he's just running a philosophical division for the whole process, because this is a tactic of the powers that be, is they want you to be helpless so that they can push.
And his first name is also a hypochondrism, Nick instead of Nicholas. Like we have Joe instead of Joseph, Rogan, or all these characters. They seem to have shortened first names because they're our pals.
Hey, why you gotta drop names, man?
Yeah, and so I think he's through very sophisticated, very convincing forms of philosophical argumentation, which is 90% solid work, sprinkling in a little bit of that foreclosure, where hey, you can't escape this, so you might as well run with it, kind of
lie
thing.
down, lie down and take it.
Yeah, and I think the true predators among us, the predators, shall we say, of maybe not to get too poetic here, but of nature herself, the balanced predators, the predators who hunt when they're hungry, but not purely out of glee, right? But that perhaps the balanced predators will be more easily shown, because we can see when we're being set up to be predated, to some degree. So you got to be a bit of a predator just to understand the mind of a predator. It's just having that executive control. I think that sovereign disposition of knowing when and when not to implement that in more of a balance, perhaps.
And my final thought on it is, the true predators among us will come to the conclusion, if you can't beat them, join them. They may join the ranks of the power structure and kind of get part-time jobs working for Elon Musk and the Illuminati and Mossad, or whoever will give them a start. CIA. Anyway.
Well, with that, gentlemen, we actually have a lot more to discuss. I've
Yeah.
written sort of topics for future conversation. And there's what, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, it's about 7. I think I've got another one in my mind as well that I'll probably write out. But yeah, so we should do this again. This was absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Like I mentioned, I'm mostly available on the weekends. But are you kind of excluded from talks coming up, Silas? I thought you had mentioned something along those lines. You'll be kind of busy coming up soon. Was that correct?
I will, yeah, I will be returning back to university, but I should be fine for the first couple of weeks, because I'll just be sort of getting us into the new semester, so I should be fine for the first couple of weeks. After
Gotcha.
that, I may be slightly slightly busier. Pardon.
Gotcha. Okay, very good. Well, yeah, excellent talk. Really love the chat, guys, and obviously any criticisms do send my way. I'd love to also get Armin in here too, or in one of these discussions. So maybe get his insight on it. That'd be awesome. But love the chat, and we'll do it again soon.
Great
Absolutely,
chatting to you,
man.
man. Take care.
All right,
Thank
take
you
care,
to all
guys.
the listeners for
Thank you.
listening in, and until the next one. Bye bye.
Good night, all. Take care.